Okay, it's been a minute. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. My name is Derek Lambert. In case you're new to the channel, I am the host of this program called MythVision, and I'm being joined today by Dr. Kara Cooney, who is an Egyptologist, an expert when it comes to everything almost Egypt. I mean, not everything. You know how it goes, Kara. Someone might go, well, I'm actually an expert on the old kingdom, and you're not focused on the old, it's the new, as any field. But welcome back to MythVision. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on, as always. And yeah, Egyptology is difficult. We got 3,000 years of history and then reception. So it's hard to be an expert of all of it. But I do my best.
Well, you are well-spoken and you've thought through this stuff. And one of my favorite personal things is your flexibility to think beyond the, I want to use the word dogma, but like beyond the limited scope of just Egyptian thought, because you recognize how influential Egypt was on the world as Mesopotamia was on the world. And you're willing to kind of think outside the box that we typically don't see often. And then ones that we do sometimes are dry academics, so they're not as entertaining, and you're entertaining. So these are my little pats on the back. I hope that sounded right. I don't want it to be like rude.
Oh no, I just said to someone at UCLA, I'm like, why can't undergraduate education be entertaining? Why is this a problem? Why are we then selling it out if we're entertaining? So that's, yeah, I have no problem with jazz hands trying to make something fun, right? It's
exactly.
Okay. Yeah,
exactly. I appreciate everybody in the chat. I mean, we've had some people here that have been here for years watching. Thanks to everybody who's been supportive of what we're doing here. Look, a couple years, was it 2 years, year and a half ago? It's been a while since I flew to California, went down there in person. We recorded a course with you on MVP.
In my living room.
In your living room, surrounded by your books and everything, meeting your family, the whole nine. Yeah. So people could go and sign up and take your course, which you are planning on doing Zoom meetings with students as well. Mm-hmm. And this one is specifically on creation mythology in ancient Egypt. Fair warning up front, it is clearly much older than Genesis when it comes to its creation account and how it describes creation. It's far more complex than Genesis that we find in the Bible. And it is extremely sexual, I will say, and very human in a way, even though it, of course, is talking about divinities. But it makes us think about divinities in a way that we, in our post-Plato, post-Platonic, philosophical world, do not think of these gods that way. And we cannot imagine gods would die, or gods literally would be pregnant, or gods would sleep with mortals, or any of these kinds of things. That is what I kind of picked up as I listened to you teach.
Yeah, the Egyptological perspective, I think, is useful because I don't go into, well, let me put it this way. The 3,000 years of history demand a telescopic perspective, and you have to fly like an eagle above a lot of the weeds, because you can see within the Egyptological streams of text that one story can morph into a slightly different story, which can morph into another story, which can morph into another story. And to see it within 3,000 years of Egyptian history, it doesn't surprise me that you can see a historical Jesus, a human figure, then when he is divinized, be divinized with one story being brought in, and then another stream being brought in, and then another tradition. For an Egyptologist, it actually makes perfect sense, and it isn't upsetting.
Yeah.
And I'm not coming at it from the Christian perspective first. I am coming at it from the Egyptological and Egyptian perspective primarily. And that's why I don't think it disturbs me as much that there are multiple ways of understanding Jesus from gospel to gospel. There's different ways of understanding Jesus in a post-gospel reception world. It doesn't upset me. And I know a lot of the apologists that you deal with, they go right into, I don't know why the camera's doing that, but they go right into the weeds. And it's every time
it's your iPhone. It's your iPhone. Modern technology.
I don't and I turned it off. I thought I turned it off on my iPad, but I think we're using StreamYard, and that's why it's doing that. So I apologize to your viewers for my
I hope nobody
going crazy.
We apologize in advance. Before we get deep, deep, deep into this, because I think it's just stay tuned, because it's only going to get deeper and then deeper and then deeper. Initially, I mentioned before we stream that lately I have been getting into the weeds with apologists. I know that I kind of come out of that world where
That's the name of your memoir, In the Weeds with Apologists.
In the Weeds with the Apologists, smoking the weeds. Just kidding. So I get into the weeds. Just as an analogy, you will never satisfy someone who is protecting their sacred lore. Yeah. Someone who is identifying with that tradition, so much so that it is an attack when you start to compare, in some way simplify or make it human rather than divine. There's so many aspects of this that I see happen. And my recent contention has been with an apologist, Michael Jones, delving into Dionysus and wine miracles, and just showing, not only just giving a little bit of a educational tutorial on how far back this guy was changing wine, doing wine miracles, where water is actively involved. And he tried to say it's not water in the wine, which we have a video coming out on that. But your point was like, D, I get it, more power to you. But like, even in our show today, there is nothing that will suffice the person who's not truly looking for that truth. They believe they have the truth, and therefore, what is there more to look for? They have it. It's their tradition, their belief, and therefore they're correct. So they can't really think outside that box typically, and I get that. I've been there. Did you want to address that before we move forward into any type of Egyptian mythology kind of laying the groundwork long before Christianity shows up on how that might have influence, or even potentially a model for which the Greco-Roman world might be working off of, as well as Christianity?
I think one of the ways that Christians created their religion was in opposition to all of the religions that came before it. And to do so, they had to use all of these details to discount, to say that they were demonic, to say how they were wrong. And it's a complete shift from what religion had been before. And I'm discounting the monotheism of the Hebrews, Judaism, all of this. I'm really talking about polytheistic traditions in the Mediterranean region and the world at large. But when the Christians come in, like somebody like Justin the Martyr, or whatever, they're trying to get people to believe in this Christian way of doing things. They have to then say, oh, this God with the goat's head, he is the devil. And this goddess in this way, if she's not the Virgin Mother, you know, she is also doesn't exist or is wrong. And so there is an attempt to go through all of the polytheistic traditions that existed before and then prove them wrong. Whereas if you're embedded in the polytheistic world, all of those traditions can work with one another. Zeus went to Egypt in the 5th century BCE. I think it's 5th. I always get it mixed up if it's 5th or 6th. Doesn't matter. Oh no, it's 6th, isn't it? Because he was there when the Persians were there. Anyway, when Herodotus goes in, he's like, oh, their Amun is our Zeus. And he has no problems with it. It's like, oh, I can equate this and that. They're going to do it in a different way. Their mythology is about their version of Zeus, their Amun is going to be, they're going to be different from ours, but it doesn't upset Herodotus. The weeds are not going to disturb him because he's there on an eagle eye level and he's able to see the connections. They're both creator gods. They're both gods of the heavens. They're both gods who have families that procreate and create all of the elements of the earth. And you could go on and on, right?
Yeah.
It's when you create Christianity and you have to say these other things are wrong, that you are creating an exclusive religion, that you get into the weeds and you start to say, oh no, this can't be right because this is the correct way of understanding it. And you use your scriptures, which a polytheist would never use. A polytheist is going to see the text and prayer and hymn and history of the divinity as alive and something to be worked with and rewritten. It is a constantly moving thing. Once you scripturalize, you lock it down, then you're going to be arguing over details until the end of time. So much of what we're talking about is a polytheistic perspective and frame of mind versus a monotheistic perspective and frame of mind, or an inclusive perspective and frame of mind, and an exclusive perspective and frame of mind. The two do not meet very well. And so you, Derek, you can go into the exclusive dogmatic side. And if you do, then you're going to be having conversations with people about whether or not this particular detail of Dionysus links up with that particular detail of Jesus.
Right. And if they find a difference, they capitalize on that difference, and then it's never a winning game. You can never, you give up while you can kind of thing. Because it's like,
there's this understanding of complete truth versus complete truth or complete fakery, and it just won't work. But if you move over to the inclusive polytheistic side and you understand the human beings are messy, that they're trying to understand what the hell is going on in the world, they're telling creation mythologies, they're retelling them, and then they move somewhere and they tell them in a different way, given that they're not dealing with palm trees but oak trees or whatever. It'll be a different kind of story depending on where they are, where they're embedded. They might bring some things, they might get some things from where they go. But if you see it in that messy way, like so there's a book that I've been really interested in lately by this guy named Michael Witzel, German scholar, Sanskritist from Harvard. And he's written a book called The Origins of Mythology. And I think you have this book, and we talked about this. And neither of us has worked through it carefully, but this is the perspective that I'd like to go to, which is treating mythologies, narratives about religion, understandings of God as language trees. And that's what this guy did. He's like, okay, I'm going to look at mythology of the past 100,000 years of human history like a language tree. And I'm going to look at big things, not the weeds, big things like this is a creator god of the earth. This is a creator god of the sky or whatever. And I'm going to track the big elements of the stories. And I'm going to see how they move around the globe. I'm going to see how they move out of Africa and into West Asia and down into Central Asia and into Australia. And he did this. And it's astonishing and crazy and bizarre, but you can see mythology move like a language tree. And then if you have that big picture perspective, then when you're talking about Jesus, which is the topic here, you're talking about how do you make a human divine? And many polytheistic religions made a human divine. So then how does that work? And how are we to understand this? And where might we see connections and disconnections? And we can go from there.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot to unravel. There's so much material there. So it's unfortunate that an early sect, me and Neil, Gnostic Informant, for those who don't know, have been diving in, planning on writing an article at some point here to cover Christmas. And there seems to be an early tradition that me and him uncovered about this pertaining to what day Christians are celebrating this on. And that is not December 25th. It's January the 5th. But we stumbled across sources that actually indicate an epiphany. And many of these stories have birth narratives for Dionysus, but also an epiphany presence. And then many of the authors are equating Harpocrates, who's also being born, which is Horus, for those who don't know, and these Hellenistic authors, at around the winter solstice, 7-month terms, similar to what Epiphanius describes as Christ having a 7-month term. Like there's just some interesting overlaps that we're finding traditionally. And Clement of Alexandria is actually mentioning a Basilidean early Gnostic teacher who's celebrating the baptism with certainty, and it's a bit ambiguous, may actually even be implying the birth, though there's a good case to make that it's just baptism. However, Christians started attributing the birth the same day as an epiphany, the presence manifestation of Christ on the very same day that the presence and manifestation of Dionysus appeared over and over. Then you get to Epiphanius in the 4th century, who's saying the idolaters are practicing the same day, the same festivity, an epiphany of Christ, the same day that's happening, they're having an epiphany of Ion, Osiris, there's another god. But to get even more, where it gets even more interesting to me is he then describes how even to this day, on that very day, Christ changes the streams into wine, where you can get intoxicated in the 4th century, when Dionysus has been doing that for a millennia before the New Testament. And so we're going to start unraveling this and getting people who are actually open-minded to see this. They'll probably be really fascinated by the evidence. All that to say, early Christians were already, these Naasines, which became heretics, were doing what you're talking about. And they were saying you can go to the mysteries of Attis and see Christ in them. You can see it in Dionysus. You could see it in the various other deities, right, that are in the mystery religions. And they had no problem with seeing the pagan, horrible word, but the non-Jewish, non-Christian literature as though it was foretelling. Kind of like Christians have no problem saying Jewish lore, which they wouldn't call it lore, but like Jewish prophets and Jewish scripture was foretelling Christ. These guys saw both Jewish and the whole world as foretelling their Christ, which is actually kind of cool, right? Like they're at least not exclusive to the point where they're cutting off everyone else. It's us versus everyone else. They're just capitalizing on the whole world, and then they become the heretics.
Yeah.
And
most
then
people don't try to create a new beginning from whole cloth. I mean, that's not something that people generally do, and to try to claim it really implies and demands an attempt at fakery, because it is an unusual thing for people to come up with what does Shakespeare say? There's nothing new under the sun. For people to come up with a story that is completely and totally new and has no connections to anything else. This is what Christians are now saying the Jesus story is, which in my opinion is ridiculous, because everything that is in the Jesus story is there connected to what people are dealing with. What you just mentioned about Dionysus and Jesus connects to Osiris and to festivals of seasonality. And these are agricultural gods, and understanding when the wine grapes are ready, when the grain is ready, and when you can harvest, or when it's going to be planted, or whatever. The seasons are different in Egypt versus a rain-fed agricultural space, to be sure. But we still live on this earth with long days and short days, and the sun moving around, and Kara, all of those things are connected too.
It gets even more like it even gets more explicit in Epiphanius and Clement. He describes it happening on the 11th of Tebe. So it's an Egyptian calendar. Like we don't even have time to get into all that today. I just want to like tease and let people know, like, be on the lookout, because I'm going to have you come back. We're going to like start unraveling this more. And I'm hoping that people will become students of yours by joining your course and stuff. But we wanted to deal with the birth. I appreciate the super chat we had earlier. We'll get to that toward the end. I don't want to distract us from the focus of the birth narrative, because there was actually an email I received just recently from a gentleman. I'm not sure if they feel comfortable with me giving out their name, but they sent a response. And look, I am all about academics and hearing various academics that when I'm persuaded, I tend to naturally lend more time and energy into an area that makes more sense to me than some academics who don't quite sometimes go down the same path as what makes the most sense to me. Now, who am I? I don't claim to be one. I don't claim to be an expert in anything. If anything, I'm an expert in communication and having conversation with various people who have different views, and being friends with people who aren't friends with those people and actually hate those people, but I'm friends with that person and I'm friends with you, and I'm trying not to get in the middle, but I like to learn. And trust me, there's a lot of beef out there. So a video was done not long ago. I know Dan McClellan did one. Usually every Christmas, there are people who come out just, Christmas is purely Christian, no pagan origin, no pagan root even. It's just an authentic, original Christian thing. We can explain
nothing to do with the winter solstice at all.
Right.
Nothing to do with the birth of divinity or the connection between divinity and humanity. Again, yes. I find this extraordinary, but go on.
Yeah. So the responses are typically to full-blown what's called zeitgeist. If you don't know about this documentary, it's like there's also some conspiracy stuff that was attached to it as well. I went through this as I got into comparative mythology, and then started to read actual academics and become more rigorous and refine my skills of like what I'm looking at and go to primary sources and stuff. But zeitgeist is the low-hanging fruit everyone wants to jab at. What happens is you get good scholars and good thinkers like Dan McClellan and others who will find those faulty things, which I could point out the flaws in them as well. But sometimes I feel like they are kind of giving ammunition to the other side by not giving the whole picture in a fair way. Maybe because they're not into comparative mythology. Maybe they don't see any credibility to the field of histories of religion. I don't know what the reasoning behind that is, and I don't want to attribute motivation in a negative way. But what I have found is, yeah, Horus wasn't born on December 25th. There's no text that explicitly says that. But there is a text that says that Harpocrates, which is Horus, was born around the winter solstice. Okay, so we don't have like 25th, but we have an idea of a rough around date, right? But that gets dismissed because you can point out the flaw in like putting an exact day of 25th. Christians celebrated two major solstices, or like roughly around the winter solstice dates, January 6th and the 25th. And
there are tens of millions of Christians who celebrate Christmas, the birth of Jesus, in January.
Right. I'm just making that point to kind of paint, like, there's like a tendency of like being overly careful, but also giving credibility to the Christians apologists in a way who are going to use this as ammunition to go, look, this guy over here dismisses the whole idea of what you're trying to do. And I feel like we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater when we're
and you're
doing
also trying to fight fire with fire, because if you try to fight the apologist by getting into the weeds and going into all of the details, you will lose, because anybody who's holding on to dogma and scripture is going to be able to say, but this detail doesn't match your detail, and thus this is a wholly new thing. It is unique. It doesn't exist anywhere else, and thus I am right. But if you transcend that and you say, but look, these are both divinities associated with agriculture, death and rebirth, connections of human and divine, and how we work with that puzzle of how we are as above, so below, that we are of divinity and yet not divinity, and how do you die and become reborn? Those big topics. If you do that, then you're going to really strike a death blow to all of these weedy arguments that aren't going to, they're not going to be able to stand up. So I would stay out of the weeds. I mean, don't get me wrong, I can't wait to read this article about the birthday and how they're because it's quite possible that the origins of this day have an ancient polytheistic source, and I would love to see it. And I wouldn't be surprised, because we live in a seasonal world, no matter what we get from Trader Joe's that is out of season from someplace else. But that doesn't mean that that's the only way that you go at this argument, because it's not gonna hold and sustain what it is you're trying to do, which is trying to position the narrative of Jesus into a much longer and larger stream of human understandings of divinity. That's what you're trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. Getting in the weeds with them may not be good. It might be good for your own community to kind of let people understand, look at this. But I like the broad, like you said, backing up a little bit. I like to do a little bit of both, going in, backing out. I've been known to say it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, quacks like a duck, the duck test, which is kind of an abductive reasoning. It's like you don't need to tell people red light in traffic is stop, or stop, red stop sign, the octagon shaped stop sign means stop.
Yeah.
Now, maybe someone who doesn't drive or isn't old enough to know these things, but everyone seems to universally understand those kinds of things. And when you back up and you see the divine births and the narratives and stuff and how that works across every single culture, but then you get to this one. This one happened, though, but every single other one never happened.
Yeah.
You can see why that immediately smells of special pleading. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I do. I completely do. And one place that I go to when dealing with this dogmatism and fundamentalism is a larger understanding of the water in which we swim, of the system that organizes us. And that system is called patriarchy. And I don't want to freak everybody out and think, oh, she's going to go man-hating. No, patriarchy is simply ruled by the fathers. It is part of the agricultural revolution that happened some 5,000, 7,000, depending on where you are in time and space, 500 if you're here in California, years ago. And it is hoarded and exploited resources that are in the hands of a very few men. Patriarchy is bad for men, most men too. It is certainly bad for women and children. And patriarchy is part of what demands that religions worship an agricultural god of bread at all. But here we are arguing about gods of bread, gods of wine, gods of agriculture, and we're also masculinizing divinity. And so much of this argument, so much of what we're talking about with the Jesus narrative, with connections to Dionysus, with connections to Zeus or Amun-Re, and I know we're going to talk about a lot of these things, these are all masculine divinities. It is a very recent human development to try to put all divinity into one masculine basket, if you like. Even a basket is a feminizing thing. But to masculinize divinity is to dogmatize, is to win, and to claim that you have the true religion and the others are a false religion. Patriarchy it tries to own and contain and exclude what is not a part of their. It scripturalizes, and I would say a lot of this begins with Akhenaten's religion, of solar light, in which religion is very much masculinized for the first time. Even though Nefertiti was there as a divine feminine, the god itself is a masculinized entity. There are elements that suggest a feminist edge, but Akhenaten is the human on earth that is the mouthpiece for this god's power. And I think a lot of this comes from those kinds of ancient understandings. Akhenaten is not the only one to do this. There's other religions that are masculinizing divinity. Of course, Yahweh is a masculinization of divinity. Does Ashura exist somewhere in scriptural texts? Yes. Is there a divine feminine that's been excluded? Yes. But you're trying to put everything into the masculine. And when you do those things, you create this trap of this is the way that it happened and only this way. And it becomes a competitive religious discussion rather than a cooperative and agglutinative collective sort of religious understanding. And I would rather look at it in that much broader way. And when you see it that way, you're like, okay, I get why this is, everyone's yelling and screaming over whether this Jesus narrative is brand new and cut from whole cloth, or if it is something that does find roots in polytheistic traditions going back thousands of years. And I think the latter explanation makes a hell of a lot more sense and doesn't discount from historical Jesus, but it is showing how humans divinize a human person. How do you divinize a human person? And the Egyptians taught us that with people like Imhotep, who was also a human person and also divinized. So there's a lot of perspectives I have on this topic.
I think that was one of the issues that got brought up. I could play the clip, but how long do we want to play a clip? I can kind of just give a little bit of a gist. Seemed like the idea that you almost get this idea in general too. Bart Ehrman has said this as well, like in his other virgin birth course. He didn't seem to imply there were other virgin births. He goes in and points out that all of the other polytheistic divine births are typically through sexual union or are through sexual union. I don't think he emphasized that they were through non-sexual union. Then I did an interview with M. David Litwell right after I had done this recording with Bart Ehrman. M. David Litwell goes into Plutarch and points out that two Greek terms that we find describing the birth of Plato, where Apollo, Phoebus in Latin, but Apollo comes and impregnates the mother of Plato through his pneuma, spirit, and dynamos, power. So there's no sexual interaction whatsoever between Apollo and the mother of Plato. The same is said of other characters that we know of. But I was asking you, are there any other virgins potentially? Are there any other, you know what I mean? Like these kind of divine births. And I thought about what you just said there about the idea of it becoming centralized to male. Even the myth of Zeus with Dionysus and Semele. She wants to see his glory. He flexes, boom, lightning bolt, zap, she's dead. Takes the fetus, sews it into his bosom, and that's somewhere between his chest and his like knees. It's in there, in this region, almost like he's carrying Dionysus like a mother would. So the father is giving birth to the son in a way.
This is a way of excluding the divine feminine completely, Derek, which is super interesting, right? Think about it. The divine birth mythology is nothing more than a masculine god creating another masculine god without using the woman as a creative element, but only using her as a vessel. And the Egyptians helped to create this and really perfected this. The idea of a virgin woman, I think, just adds, it takes from this really prudish, really people with a whole lot of problems with sex in general. And I think it's another addition to that a polytheist would never really have, but it shows how patriarchal communities also make scarce sex. They monopolize sex. You're only supposed to have sex in certain ways and times. And
if so I may, just to add to your point, the philosophers, especially, we know the New Testament is entrenched with the philosophy of Stoic and Cynic and Platonic thought, when you look at the men, right here we are, right? Plato's Symposium, like Aristotle, notice where's the female philosopher, ladies and gentlemen? But also just to add to that, like when you see what they've done, they kind of rationalize their way into going, you know, gods that are immortal can't have passions like us, can't love in that way, can't have sexual interaction. That's gross. That might have worked at a time when gods were closer to humans in the Age of Heroes, back here in the Trojan War, where gods mingled with humans. They have separated themselves, which might be somewhat, I don't know, makes me rethink of Genesis 6. Like back then, before the flood, like humans and gods could mingle, and now we're outside of that. It's just kind of echoing that same theme. But later, it becomes like gods don't have those things, and then sex becomes ill, and then it's like, no, that's bad. Even so much so that they put in the mouth of Jesus, and I don't know if this goes back to the guy or not, but he says in Matthew, believe it's chapter 7, somewhere toward the end. He just, 3/4 of the way, I don't know exactly, but he says that people who are born eunuchs or become eunuchs, because they can, are like the greatest. Like if you can do that, well, what does a eunuch do to their stuff, right? So there is this drive that's already in the air, and your point is well put. And I just think that's got to play a role in how they're describing these gods interacting and causing these children to come up. Now they have to just touch you or breathe. They're not interacting in any way to create the child. They're doing it in a different manner. I don't know though.
So let me also say where I think a lot of this comes from. It comes from the creation of complex civilization. It comes from the notion that the leader of such a complex civilization, the king, and there are many different words for kings in different civilizations, has a divine component. The Egyptians grappled with this arguably more than anybody else because the king is human and here on earth, and yet is meant to be the offspring of divinity, right? Mm-hmm. So how do you have a human being on earth who is divine, who will still die, and how is he recreated again? And so you have all of these complex mythological understandings, like a divine birth mythology of how the god Amun-Re or some other creator god visits the mother of the king, as impregnates her via the actual human father, but that the divine king is of divine essence. So the Egyptian king is part God and part human. You have the Greeks grappling with this as well. You have the Romans grappling with this as well. Right. That there's this understanding of what is divine and what is human. Where does it stop? Where does it start? Jesus is a part of that discussion. He is part divine. He is part human. He is mortal. He can be killed. He can be reborn, right? So he's a special, unusual kind of case, but an Egyptian king can be reborn in a sense, not as the same person necessarily, but with the spirit of kingship associated with him. So essentially the Jesus mythology or Jesus narrative to me is trying to understand, how does God send out a masculine part of himself onto this earth? How does he then create himself through his own transmission? And it's the Holy Spirit, which in Gnostic texts has a very feminine edge to it, right? Through
Zoe, correct? Isn't it Zoe? Yeah. Or different terms for different.
Associated with breasts and mother's milk and wombs and things like that, which is really, really interesting. So it's not a complete removal of the feminine, but it is using the feminine as that vessel, right? And then, as I discuss in my course, you have all of these discussions of the self-created God, the God like the sun god, who can be called the bull of his mother, who impregnates his own mother at his own death when he moves into her mouth and she swallows him, and then he's reborn through her body after that sunset moves through her body, and then he's reborn in the east. But he creates himself, and that understanding of a self-created God is also what we have in the Jesus mythology. It's a God who is of the Father God in the heavens. Oh Father, why have you forsaken me? Or oh Father, I commit my soul unto your your hands, right? But he is mortal, but then he can be reborn and then joins the Father in the heavens. So it's those same kinds of people working with where does the human stop and the divine begin, but also how do you understand kingship and leadership, special humans who are separate from other humans, how are they different? And
do you find it ironic that Jesus is playing as a king? I mean,
no,
obviously,
that's what I'm saying. It all comes from this. It all comes from the Egyptian idea. Not that there's no Levantine idea attached to it. Of course there is. And that's where, when you have the Levantine and the Egyptian, which are right next door to each other, but very different cultures, one rain-fed, one coming from the Nile. And so you have different ways of making a living, different economies, different ways of organizing society. And thus, when they come together, even though they are so close, there is a bit of an explosion in disagreement about how these things actually work. And thus you have Jesus. It's not, so you have some things that are Egyptian, some things that are Levantine, many things that are Mesopotamian, and an Assyriologist would have better perspective there.
Of course. And there is overlap, right? Because I mean, there is conversation going back to like the Amarna letters. There's so much overlap and trade and things that are happening where these stories in Egypt and in Mesopotamia are overlapping. So like, you don't have to be so like, it could be a little bit of everything here, like you said.
And then all happening in the context of the Roman Empire, which is bringing in a Hellenistic tradition, bringing in a Latin tradition, and good luck to you. It's a mess, and it's human, and it's the way we should expect it to be. And again, for an Egyptologist who looks at how mythologies change over 3,000 years, it's not surprising. And remember, we had a Council of Nicaea in, I think, the 4th century, that, you know, where all the bishops go in there and they're like, we want this book. We don't want that book. We don't want the book of Jesus as a child. We want Luke, Matthew, Mark, John. We don't want people, other, right. Certain people of power were like, we do want this. We don't want that. When you start to read the Apocrypha and you read all of these Coptic and Greek texts that are people who are trying to figure out who this Jesus dude was, what it means, you see how it becomes embedded into a polytheistic tradition. Much of that is what was removed so that Christians in the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries AD would be able to say, this is wholly unique. This is new. There was nothing like it before. And that's the point. That's why certain books were chosen and others were excluded. And to really understand Christianity, you have to take all of it on board to understand how this religion developed, which is what scholars of Christianity, of course, do.
So I titled this video, right? And I feel like we're finally getting 40 minutes into this, right? We're finally getting like to the bread and butter of our discussion that I think is going to be important. That was all necessary to kind of paint the way before you end up doing any kind of comparisons. And I would ask that we maybe have you tell us the earlier story that you think, or earlier stories, if you have more than one, we're all ears, but like the earlier story that you would suggest would have been a proto-template narrative, well-known, that may have even influenced many of the Greek myths or Roman myths, or you never know, like how far, but especially as you think this might look like a proto-version of what we're seeing depicted in the New Testament with Jesus. So can you kind of give us that story that you see here in Egypt? And then I ask our audience to be mindful that many of the experts I talk to say as early as you can possibly imagine Christianity taking off, one of the most prevalent places this stuff goes viral is in Egypt, Alexandria. If you do not know how important Alexandria, Egypt was and significant to the spread of Christianity, keep studying it, look into it, because there's a lot more here. So I'm not saying it wasn't spreading in Rome and, but.
And how exclusive and dogmatic that Christianity ended up becoming. Never forget that Cyril of Alexandria, bishop of the 6th century, did order and encourage a mob to murder the intellectual philosopher and scientist Hypatia. And he had her flayed alive by a mob of Christians who were saying that she was a heretic, apostate, or pagan, somebody who needed to be removed, that made people doubt their faith in Christ, in the Christ. And this is the context in which much of what we're discussing is coming from. So it's in Egypt that, on the one hand, for the 3,000 years that I study it, is flexible and polytheistic, and one story can morph into another. But as Christianity is developed and you see the patriarchs take hold and Christianity not being illegal to the Roman Empire, but instead being accepted and used as a tool of power by the Roman Empire, Christianity then becomes more dogmatic than ever before, and those scriptures are locked down, and you have people murdered because they don't
literally
believe.
Locked down later in Latin,
Yes.
where people are not able to read it and it's chained to the pulpit.
Yeah, Greek and Latin. And you know, I was just watching this the wonderful Thomas Cromwell, if you're into Henry VIII and Tudor history, there's a really good miniseries called Wolf Hall. Sorry, that's the name of it. And Tyndale has just produced a Bible in English, and all of the men of the 16th century, the intellectuals, are collecting and going, there's no discussion of monks and nuns and monasteries and the Eucharist, and oh my God, it's a whole new world. Can you imagine if the world of your Christianity was parsed to you through these powerful men who excluded you from understanding the direct scriptural source by the time you get to the 16th century? And then you're able to read the direct scriptural source, and it blows your mind, because all the things you think are Christian, and the Eucharist ceremony and all how it's done, and the host being magic and the body of Christ, and it's not in the Bible in the way that you thought it would be. It's, you know, things are complicated is what I'm saying. And it's important, if you're using Egypt, to remember that Egypt also goes through its own throes of different contexts of power, different social structures. And so the Christian social structure towards the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries becomes really exclusionary and brutally violent against those they consider heretics. And many of the people who are coming at you, I assume this is not my crowd, not my monkey, not my circus.
Definitely not. Yeah.
Right. Not my crowd, but I know they come at you with a lot of passion, and they're doing so with that same vitriol that I see from the Cyrils of Alexandria of the world. But to go back to your question. So there, you know, remember Jesus, if there's a historical Jesus, and I think there almost certainly was. I don't have a time machine to prove it, but sure. The mythologies and narratives that we have that have come down to us are coming to us from a crucible in the Roman imperial world of a Hellenistic Greek world in Levantine context with Mesopotamian inheritances, and then goes to Egypt, or there are already Egyptian ideas there. I have argued in other contexts. So it's a mishmash of African, West Asian, European, Mediterranean politics, society, and understandings of God. Okay. But does Egypt have a part to play in that? Yes. And what mythology would best help us to understand the Jesus mythology? We have to go to Isis, Horus, Osiris, right?
Someone may not even know who, I know that might sound weird to you. Someone may not know who they are and what their story is. I think perfect time, of course, as you're segueing into this, to tell us who they are, what that significant story was, how far back this story was told or understood. I know that the story changes over time, but maybe you can give us like when the version of it that you think best suits this comparison and stuff like that. Sorry.
No, you got to always do that to academics, because we stay.
Got to hone you in,
right?
Yeah.
We'll just do things in our way for a long time before you step in. So the first evidence for the god Horus is very early. Like I would say like 3,500, 4,000 BCE. So we're talking 6,000 years ago for first evidence of this hawk god, this far one of the heavens, who's associated with kingship, but associated with solar religion. Really, it's the human divine. And how do you understand that connection between human and divine? You don't get a real mention of Osiris and Isis in connection with Horus until the pyramid texts. And those are not written down until around 2400 BCE. But that doesn't mean that the pyramid texts have very archaic language in them that suggests they are as old as 2900 BCE, 3000 BCE in a verbal form, but aren't written down until later. And so we're talking old, right? This is, and the kinds of mythologies that people would need to work with in a complex society. Ideas of who's in charge of me? Why do I give up my control of my independence to a larger force? What is divinity? What is kingship? and how do I organize all of this? So the story goes, as we read it in the pyramid texts, in a very well, let me say this. The Egyptians they have a different exclusivity. If there's an exclusivity amongst the apologists you're dealing with about what one should and shouldn't believe, the ancient Egyptians had an exclusivity about what you could and could not write down. And talking about some of the more problematic or violent parts of this story in a written way, in an open way, was hugely, it was anathema for the ancient
almost
Egyptians.
Like a mystery cult in a way. Like you're not allowed to tell people the whole thing.
This is why we know so little about the Mithras cult, for example, or even parts of the Isis cult, as we understand from Apuleius's golden ass. You're not supposed to write this stuff down. Words have power in the ancient Egyptian mindset. Words are magical. And so you try to keep you mention things obliquely. So there'll be things in the pyramid text that talk about the day Osiris fell underneath a particular tree, or that might mention the violent one, and that would be in reference to Seth, Osiris's brother. Egyptologists have to use thousands of years of mythological traditions to piece this story together, because one of the first places it's written down is by this Greek dude named Plutarch in the 1st century CE, AD, who wrote this stuff down during Roman imperial occupation of Egypt. And he says in the text, I'm writing stuff down. The priests have told me not to write down, but here it is. And he gives a version of the Osiris and Seth contendings, and then the contendings between Horus and Seth, and then how Horus ends up becoming king. And you have it there in the Greek, and you're like, okay, I get it, I understand it. You can then apply that general story to the pyramid text story in its oblique, abstract, oh, this is the day Osiris fell under this tree, or this is the day Osiris was something violent happened. That's a passive voice.
Right.
But the story is Osiris is king of Egypt. He's king. He has a wife. His wife is Isis, and they are there as the archetypal kings. He's a god of the harvest. He's a god king, right? And he's there ruling, and his brother Seth is a warrior god, and he's quite violent, and he wants the kingship, and he is jealous. And we are to understand that there is competition for this kingship. Some people want it, some people are meant to have it legally, some people are not. And Seth tries to take it by force. And there's different versions of this. Does he make a coffin and he tricks Osiris to get into it, and then he kills him, or he kills him in other ways? This is where it gets interesting. It's where you can have two different versions of Genesis in the Bible today, right? There's always different versions.
Birth narratives for Jesus.
Exactly.
Anyway,
right? So
go ahead.
And we shouldn't be upset by that. People are in one place, are going to have one version, another version, another place. And in the polytheistic mindset, that doesn't mean that one is right and one is wrong. People aren't even thinking in those ways. They're just oh, there's this version and there's that version. So there's many ways of killing Osiris. An apologist would say, oh, this version of killing Osiris is wrong, and so it can't be connected. But I'm not going to think that way. We don't need to think.
Or harmonize both. He got into the coffin and this. I'm just kidding. Anyway.
Yeah, exactly. No, but you're totally right. You're totally right.
Yeah.
So he gets killed by Seth, right? It is a violent ending. And Seth then says, I am now king, haha. But there is a conundrum. There is a problem. And really, this is about kingship as a legal system and how it should work. And in the tale, Horus and Seth, that we have produced probably sometime in the New Kingdom, maybe a bit earlier, but the version we have is a late Egyptian version.
For those who don't know New Kingdom, when is New Kingdom? Just giving
starting
dates.
1550 BC, going to about 1100.
So bronze to almost early Iron Age. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, late bronze to early Iron Age. Yeah.
Got it.
So it's the late bronze, essentially, is the New Kingdom. And there's a text that we call the Contendings of Horus and Seth. And that is written in late Egyptian, dates to around, I don't know, like 1250 BCE, roughly. And it's a lovely tale. Try to find it online. It's got sex, drugs, and rock and roll. There's a rape in there of,
wow.
of Seth trying to rape Horus and show that he's the powerful one. It's a bawdy awesome tale. When we read this in late Egyptian and hieroglyphs in class, we're laughing. We're just having so much fun. It's great. So in that text, you see that there's a legal aspect, that Seth claims the kingship, and all the gods are like, wait. You don't get the kingship. The son of the father, the king, gets the kingship. The brother can't step in and take it just because you're stronger and bigger. And we need to talk about this. So they have a legal tribunal of all of the different gods. While the legal tribunal is happening, Horus and Seth fight. And there's another story that goes alongside this and underneath this late Egyptian tale. And that is, when Horus claims to be king, Isis knows her son Horus is just, he's a child, because let me go back a little bit. So Osiris is dead, and Seth cuts him up into dozens of different pieces, and he scatters them around Egypt to make it difficult for Isis. Isis, the first magician on the planet, collects all of these body parts of the god Osiris, collects them together into the first mummy that we know of, wraps them up. She can't find his penis, no penis anywhere to be found. That's been swallowed by a fish, a magical fish. I know, goddamn, no penis. And so she magically makes a penis because she's a magician. She can do this. She attaches the penis. She then climbs on board and is able to conceive of the offspring Horus. So Horus is born and conceived and born after the death of Osiris. So it's not like Horus was always there, but in a sense, Horus was always there. Right? The son is always there with the father. The father will always be reborn. The king is dead, long live the king, right? There's always that, the self-created God will always have pre-created himself even when he's murdered. So even when he's died and there's no offspring, the offspring was already there waiting to happen, in a sense. It is the mystery, right? So Isis makes this happen, conceives and births this baby, takes this baby off to the marshes, and has to hide him from Seth. We're talking about a kind of interregnum. It's like Seth is so brutal and violent and chaotic that he can't really create a kingdom of power. We never see Seth being a king and throned and given the scepters of power. He's just raging and chaotic, right? And
it reminds me of Sargon. It reminds me kind of Moses. Kind of reminds me of this trope, right? That you would imagine they're trying to hide the baby that is destined to be the ruler.
Right. And so she's got to bring him to the marshes of the Delta and keep him away from Seth's clutches, and keep him simultaneously away from the scorpions and the snakes and the crocodiles and the hippos, all the dangerous things of the marshes. In that space, Horus becomes a super magician as well. He becomes able to overpower all of these dangerous creatures. He learns the lore of his mother. This is very much in the infancy gospel of Jesus, which is preserved in Coptic, which is one of those apocryphal texts that those bishops in Nicaea were like, no, we're not going to include this. But there are elements, there's little kernels of it in the Gospels that we have of Jesus as a child being like super magician kind of entity, right? So then Horus is there as a child. Like let's give him like 10 years of age or something like that. And Seth has been raging. Now we get to this late Egyptian tale, the contendings of Horus and Seth. The gods are having their tribunal. And Seth is like, oh, I'm going to take it to Horus. I'm going to show everyone that I'm the big bad boss man, that I'm strong and that I should be king. And the contendings begin, and they take different forms. There's a hippo battle. They both turn themselves into hippos and fight each other. There's a ship battle. They create ships, and Seth's ship is of stone and it sinks, and it's like wah wah, and it's kind of funny, right? Seth is a god of discord and violence, and he's not very smart. He's a dim sort of god, and it's funny that he's that dim. But his violence is necessary and useful. His violence is what helps the sun god be reborn in the eastern horizon. So he's very, very important. One of the only gods that's fighting for his suit to be king is the sun god. Interesting. He's like, no, I love Seth. He's my boy. He's there on the bark protecting me from Apophis every 6th hour of night. This is a really good guy. And you have an understanding that violence is something you need for kingship, as well as the legal succession from father to son. So there comes
Interesting.
a kind of climax, if I may, in the tale, The Contendings of Horus and Seth, in which Seth tries to rape Horus. And Horus knows he is about to be raped. And so he pretends, he puts his hand there. This is all in my class in more detail, but he puts his hand there, a fisted hand, and he lets Seth think that he is raping him. He collects the semen of Seth and he brings it to his mother Isis. So Seth goes to the tribunal and says, I have done a man's deed to Horus. Everyone gasps and is horrified, and they're about to give the kingship to Seth because he has committed this act of power against Horus. Horus, meanwhile, goes to Isis, shows Isis what he's done with his hand, and presents the semen of Seth to Isis. Isis shouts a mighty shout, cuts off his hand, cuts off her son's hand, takes the semen, regrows a hand from him because she is the magician.
She does have the power, yeah.
She has the power. She takes the semen of Seth and goes to Seth's house dressed as a different creature. I can't remember if she's a young woman or an old woman in this part. It doesn't really matter because she's a magician and able to do whatever she wants. She puts the semen in Seth's favorite food, this aphrodisiac lettuce that's like the Viagra of the day, and then sneaks away. Seth goes about he thinks he's won. The tribunal loves him. He eats his food, and then he goes to the tribunal. They're like, okay, we got to bring Horus and Seth in. We're going to do this all together now. And they call to the semen of Seth, like it's a little god of its own. And they go, semen of Seth, come forth. And the semen of Seth comes forth from Seth's own body, as if he's committed like an autofellatio, right? Which I suppose a god could do. And it comes out as a sun disk on his head. And we're told in the text that his face turns red and he's embarrassed and he snatches the sun disk away. And it's really funny. Right. So everyone's laughing like the tribunal of gods. This is a bawdy, awesome tale. So it means that the Egyptians were able to have fun with these mythologies as well. They don't always have to be sober and pious. Right. It brings a little of my Roman Catholicism in, where we joke about these things in a way that evangelicals would never allow themselves to do.
Right.
And there's a lot more drunkenness and magic in Roman Catholicism compared to evangelical Christianity. And don't get started with Orthodox. That's its own. Orthodox Christians also go in those directions. So a lot more jokey. But but Horus is determined to be king at that moment. They're like, oh, he wasn't raped. And, they have decided that the kingship should go from father to son. So we're dealing with multiple tropes that it's a long story, right? But let's go back to the eagle's perspective and then ask,
so
well,
we're
what the
backing
hell
up.
does this back up? What does this have to do with Jesus? Like, I don't get it. What's going on? You've got a God who can be killed and who can resurrect, right? You have a God who is a God of the harvest and of seasonality, who is associated with wheat, bread, and wine. Those things are there. You have
and if it isn't wine, it's beer, correct? So either one, beer, wine, intoxicating natural elements, of course. It's like
and
wine
the intoxication. I think the intoxication is part of this as well. Something that helps you to find a divine state that is mind altering. Right?
Got it. Okay.
You have a divine element that is able to reproduce himself. When Isis conceives of Horus, it is actually said in the text and shown in the images that it is Osiris who is creating his future self. So
she's just a vessel.
Yes, she is. And she's I'm not denigrating Isis. I would never. And there's a more complicated discussion of divine feminine in this. But when we move into the Christian space of masculinizing divinity purely, then the divine feminine is utterly removed, right? She's there just as a vessel. You have this self-created God, right? And so you have a God who is self-creating, and here Osiris and Horus are kind of the same God, but you have a father and son relationship too, don't you? You have this transmission from father to son and a resurrection in that way. And you have the story of Isis and Horus, like a Mary and baby Jesus, keeping the child safe, running to Egypt if Herod's going to kill all the firstborn, but keeping him safe from dangers, right? And that vulnerable state of the future king. You have the same understanding that even though he is God, he is, or of God, or in these mysteries, we can discuss them all day, right? But you and the Egyptians tried, but that you have to protect him, and the divine feminine does protect him, and you have the use of magic to keep him safe. Miracles are happening to
is Horus
to
performing
make all of this
miracles?
happen. Horus absolutely preserved.
So that's an important aspect. I know his mom can, but
yes, he learns from her to do these miracles of healing. And Horus, in the Egyptian sense, you see Horus standing on the crocodile, holding all the snakes and scorpions in his hands. And he is there impervious to these things. It's kind of like Neo in the Matrix when he sees the ones and zeros and he dodges the bullets. You know, Horus is the one that's able to hold the snakes and scorpions. He's like, they can bite me. It doesn't matter. Right. He is the pure magician. And the idea of Jesus being a divinity or human divinity of healing, bringing that power from the Father is also there in our text. You have a death that is necessary to create rebirth in both cases, right? The death of Jesus is there to forgive all of our sins. It is there
so that we can also be alive again after death as well in his experience, the same way Dionysus and Osiris.
And it is so that the wheat and the grain and the wine can be alive again. You will have the vines die back, and then the vines grow forth again. And you can't have that without the death. You must have the seasonal recurrence.
If I may just, this is something I've been scratching my head. I've been reading scholarship. Oh my God, there's so many books I've been reading, Kara, from New Testament scholars to you name it, even in the Hebrew Bible. And when I get to this point of dying and rising or reborn deities, of course, we can get into the details. And yes, Dionysus's rebirth is different from even Osiris's rebirth, which is different than Jesus's rebirth. And therefore, they're so different. You know what? That's the apologist angle. The other problem that I find is I wrestle with this agricultural aspect when I get to Jesus, because even in Paul, which there's so many sayings when he's giving parables or telling lessons that are related to the wheat and the seed and Jesus is saying so much stuff that is agricultural. It's not even funny. Number one, to me, red flag. I don't know why, but in my head, I keep going back to this. Like, why are we not taking that serious as if it doesn't continue in some way? I'm not saying it's polytheistic in the same cyclical manner, but they're doing something and still keeping the agricultural mind. And then Paul, when he mentions the new creation in 1 Corinthians 15, and he describes the order of creation, all creation groans like it's about to give birth. This is a renewal of agricultural, but it's a permanent fix. It's like the expectation.
And it's a masculine one. The God, the masculine divine entity, takes complete responsibility for it. The female has been pushed to the side. So it is a patriarchal agricultural revolution religion. And it's something that I would argue is rather new in the human world. And by new, I mean like 5,000 years new, right? This idea that you have the worship of a seasonal grain god. That's not something you're going to find, if we could, 75,000 years ago, or talk to a bunch of hunter-gatherers today, though there are hardly any left, and find evidence of a seasonal grain god. That's that idea of beer and grain. That's the kind of thing you're going to get with the agricultural revolution, and or with the harvesting of wild grains, like you have evidence for at Göbekli Tepe, for example, or Çatalhöyük, right? So you're saying once
humans started to observe, know when to plant or when to collect, whether or not they're doing full-blown agriculture in some way, their ritualistic tendencies of how to survive incorporate into the mythology and the mythos that we find in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and of course, all the way down into Christianity.
And when they did that, they started hoarding resources that they never did before. Hunter-gatherers would eat stuff and move along. There's no grain silos to make one man rich, to make one man king. Think of the Joseph story where the king has 7 years of grain saved up. That's money. That's wealth. That's this huge power. So this idea that you're hoarding and controlling that is a patriarchal thing that is very new, and we're trying to grapple with it. We're trying to understand it. We are worshiping a money god. This is a god of money, and I mean that very, very specifically, because this grain and money god, this god of agriculture, must commodify all of the labor that supports it, and it commodifies the women like cattle, because women are now there to connect to people's private property, to say, oh, this is my property, this is my wife, this is my marriage, I mark her as such. When you get agriculture and people are competing with each other over who hoards grain, they now need to yes, then they have to say, these are my children, this is my lineage, this is my private property. You now have to mark women like you mark cattle. You have to brand them, in a sense, with the institution of marriage like you mark cattle. This is, in my opinion, why the divine feminine is utterly removed from these religions of mythology. Not that Isis isn't powerful, but we see Osiris self-creating. We see the gods self-creating to Jesus. We see this, but it is a grain cult. It is a cult of bread. Like, think of Lord of the Rings when Gollum is like, I forgot the taste of bread, right? That's civilized man in a patriarchal form, where you control the harvest, you save the harvest, and you thereby gain extraordinary hoarded resources and power over it. It is very useful to then create an ideology that supports that patriarchal world. And this is long-term stuff that the Egyptians were grappling with for 5,000 years. Their agricultural revolution didn't come in until probably 5,000 BC at the earliest. So 7,000 years ago is the length of time that the Egyptians are working with this. And if it blows your mind to say, oh, a Jesus cult could be an amalgamation of Mesopotamian and Greek and ancient Egyptian religious understandings, then it might blow your mind to think that the Osiris, Isis, and Horus narrative in mythology is probably has much older roots that are pre-agricultural that we will never know, because they weren't written down, because pre-agriculturalists don't write stuff down. And yet they're grappling with, how do we deal with this agricultural revolution and one guy having all this power, or a few guys having all this power? And what does it mean that we're now, talking about hoarded resources and grain? They create a god of money. Like when it's a god of death and rebirth, but it's also a god of money, of grain. Money does grow on trees in the ancient Egyptian world, or stalks, if you like, right? Because grain is money. And when the Egyptian elite died, they would, the family members would create this Osiris bed, and they would have an image of Osiris in like a frame, and they would fill it with earth, and they would plant seeds in it, and then they would put that outside in the light of day. It would sprout the new wheat and barley stalks. Then they would put that into the tomb in the burial chamber with the deceased, and that Osiris bread of new life, or grain of new life, would be the rebirth of the deceased. So I just want to point out how complicated it is that land ownership and grain hoarding and agricultural creation is all mixed up with Osiris and Horus and Isis, and is also then mixed up with the Jesus cult, such as I'm there as a Roman Catholic as a child, and asking my dad, like, why is Jesus now bread? And he's like, it's a mystery. He told me it was a mystery. Like,
yeah. Oh gosh.
But like, we're eating bread and we're eating divinity, and we are told that this product that is our mainstay, this bread or wine is God. It is God. And so I'd like to put some economics in this as well.
Yeah.
And a little prosperity gospel, if I may, because it is a way of allowing very rich men who control children and women and other poorer men to use an ideology to claim all kinds of power. And it's no surprise that the Roman Empire was like, this Christianity is awesome. We're going to take it and use it, dogmatize it, and go forth. And that's what we are the recipients of today, which is why people's heads explode when you talk about this topic.
So there's a couple things you said, even in telling the story of Isis, Osiris, Horus. I thought about, again, I said this before, but new viewers may not have noticed this. I literally hear the Lion King. I hear Mufasa is set, and the new king Horus is the child of the king who recently died, but he comes back in a unique way through the sun. though he himself never returns to the realm of the living here in this world, he is his father. And there's a scene where he looks in the lake after he sees the reflection of the stars, then he looks in the lake or the pond or whatever it is, he sees his father's image in himself. And so there's so much mythology I see in Lion King of this ancient story. That tells you, I'm a parent. I go watch
But
this
I
stuff.
think it works perfectly because do you know what it does, these mythologies? They create a kind of docility, a kind of obedience. Because what we're being told is that the father-son lineage is everything. It is the most important transmission of power from God. And we're also told that the inheritance of kingship, we are told this specifically for Jesus too, right? He is King of Kings, that the inheritance of kingship is bestowed from the Father to the Son, and we must accept it. That is the way that it works. So, and it supports the entire economy of the agricultural revolution, such that you respect the landowner for whom you may be sharecropping, and you say, he is my Lord, he is my king, he is the one I must follow. Or if you're the second brother and the father dies and the eldest son is the one who if you're the brother of a rich landowner and you don't have the wealth, it goes to the son. You have to respect that transfer of power. It's also legal. It's also legal and deals with power and how it's transferred and how we need to shut up and do what we're supposed to.
Right.
And be obedient. So it
don't we feel that
too?
I mean, don't we feel that? I don't want to speak for everybody. Maybe they got a cool church and they have a cool, leader of their church. And that's
hierarchy
awesome.
is everything. Oh my God,
I mean,
love that shit. Yes.
Yeah, but like, who hasn't gone to a church that may have been a practicing Christian visiting somewhere or something? You can tell there's a shadow essence of that person, and you could see everyone around there, heads down, the tail between their legs, kind of like, this is the authority, absolute reverence, absolute. So I feel that power is always going to be there in any type of cult setting. The other thing I was going to say that came to mind is, well, two things. Number one, many of these overlaps, parallels are generic, right? So some people will go, you've just painted kind of a generic, analogous scene for Jesus. Sure. None of it is Xerox, which none of us are claiming. But is there any reason, like, I want to add in my second part just to say this. Is there any reason to think this may have had direct influence? This narrative may have had direct influence with the Jesus narratives, either one of them. We know there's good reason to see it in the non-canonical material. There's some red flags there that show clear Egyptian influence. The other part, and I don't want to distract you with this, is that we know there's a triad: father, woman, mother, right? So that you have the feminine, and son. And the Holy Spirit is described feminine often in the Greek. So you have a father, a spirit.
In the Coptic too.
Do you think, I mean, I'm sure you do because you're coming from the Egyptology side. And I know there's a mishmash, a crazy syncretism. There's a technical term. Neil from Gnostic Informant was like, you should bring this up. I didn't want to get in the weeds of this, but I might as well bring up the technical term that he used when he wrote me this. He, forgive me here. We've been going back and forth. Okay, so I'm lost in the weeds already, and it's a particular term that is this idea of theocracia, so that all gods are really one. They're like connecting all of them. Attis is really Osiris, is really Dionysus, is really Jesus. And I'm kind of wondering if you think the theology of Trinity, this is the root system, a triad that ends up becoming what we end up having explained the Trinity, so that we can make it all one and get away from that polytheistic stuff or the pagan stuff. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I think that is absolutely Egyptian, because if you're looking at the Hebrew Old Testament sources, if you're looking at the Hebrew Bible sources, you see a divine feminine in Asherah who has been systematically excluded by a Yahweh cult, but you don't have as much of a father-son, divine son connection, right? You may have prophets, you may have Moses and receiving the word of God, but they are not divine. and they're not kings. You have an anti-kingship sort of understanding. I guess you've got David and Solomon, and yeah, maybe, but David and Solomon aren't like a Jesus sort of thing. It doesn't really work. And the divine feminine is wholly excluded and demonized, very much so in this is my perspective, in the Hebrew Bible narrative. So to see this Trinity as Egyptian, I think works perfectly. I don't see any issues with it. And you don't, a lot of that is created in the matrix of Christianity in Egypt, in a Gnostic, Coptic world, and the Holy Spirit being this magical element, like an Isis that connects them all. I think it works perfectly.
But notice how she's stripped of like a direct, I'm just saying, like a stripped of a direct identity. Notice how the Holy Spirit is feminine, but like, where's that person? We call it a person in our Trinitarian theology as Christians, but like, who is she? We have an idea of a father. We even have like a visual of a father almost in our heads. We have a visual of a son. Where is any of that in the Holy Spirit? I know that there's even been conflation over the centuries with Mary being part of that Trinity in some Muslim sources.
Absolutely.
So like,
well, I think Mary kind of was the Trinity, right? But she couldn't be there because you needed to masculinize this completely, because that's where patriarchal hierarchical power comes from. You want to commodify the feminine, so you need to hide her, you need to veil her, and she's not meant to be there. I was going to say something, but
I apologize.
No, it's okay. Oh, I remember. So it's an interesting thing that in the Egyptian agricultural world, that the divine feminine is also samed out. You have, and in the story of Horus, Isis, and Osiris, Isis plays the role of all what a feminine must be. She is sexy, hot wife. She is mother. She is crone magician. She is all of the things in one body. Whereas the masculine gets to fragment, and it gets to be the father and the son, right? So you have different elements. Father is the nice old bearded dude in the sky, or Amun-Re, or Osiris, or whatever, and the son is Horus, or some other youthful element, Jesus, right? The feminine is samed out and really monolithed in a way. And it's an interesting thing that when you look at Egyptian religion and you look at the goddess on a temple wall, they look very similar. And students in their first years are like, oh yeah, but how can you tell what the difference is between Hathor and Isis? I'm like, you have to look at the name. The name is the only thing in the hieroglyphic text that is going to show you whether it's Hathor or Isis. They're going to look almost exactly the same, with the sun disk between the cow's horns and the beautiful body and youthful and blah blah blah. And this idea of the divine feminine being mother and lover simultaneously also works for the solar mythology of death and rebirth, because the sky goddess Nut is lover and mother of the sun god simultaneously, which may really upset us. But the Egyptians did say that the sun god was bull of his mother. He is able to reproduce himself with himself. I know, think about that for a while. You're like, holy shit. But if he is the bull of his own mother, then he is able to reproduce himself. And then the feminine, the divine feminine, moves in and out of different roles. So it doesn't upset the Egyptians in the way it might upset us, because then she is lover, then she becomes mother. The solar Egyptian mythologies, the sun god surrounds himself with the divine feminine. And sometimes they're his wife, sometimes they're his mother, sometimes they're his daughters. And so you have all of those things just put together. And it's not surprising that the patriarchy would do that for the Egyptian cult. And then it would take another step further to further masculinize it in the Christian understanding. And really remove Mary almost completely with the Holy Spirit instead.
Sorry, I hate cutting you off, because it's like there's so many ideas, and you are full of so many things. Go sign up for the course. It is pinned at the top. You can't miss this. So I'm going to throw something just to see what spaghetti sticks at the wall, because this is stuff everything you ever hear me mention is either inspired by some brilliant PhD who's had an idea that made sense, or at least made me consider thinking about something. And you made me think about Mary. as a character. We're dealing with narratives. So I know that some want to approach these as mundane historical biographies that actually happened and is documenting what happened on Wednesday and on Friday at 5:34 p.m. No. Most of the critical scholars that I talk to would say these are well-crafted, purposefully written narratives, stories, and they may use a bios type style, but they're still crafting a story. Mary is a character, both the mother and this Magdalene Mary. Dennis McDonald has written, one of the scholars I love.
They're kind of the same, right? They're the same.
Exactly what I was.
I love it. That this is meld into each other. One's lover, one's the peer, one's the mother. I agree.
That's what I'm thinking might potentially, and I want our audience to consider at least is thinking like, what if this character Mary is both mother and lover? Like in the sense, I know it doesn't describe anything happening. That the Gospels are purposely going to avoid.
They have to remove that. They have to remove that. She can't be in there.
But there is some red flags in these texts, especially in John's Gospel, when Jesus bends down to write in the sand. Scholars have written on this millennia. Dennis McDonald, he wrote about this, saying that he thinks this might actually be an early idea, that when he's drawing in the sand, when they're accusing her of this sexual sin, in that same gospel, you get Jews accusing Jesus of being born by sexual immorality, that his mother is sexually immoral. Well, I know this is one thing on top of another thing on top of another thing, but the Gospel of John, many scholars have pointed out, looks like a tragedy. And Euripides is also working with it. It's a tragedy. Anyone who knows about Euripides' Bacchae is a tragedy. In that story, Dionysus' mom, who is like a vessel, giving birth to Dionysus by Father Zeus, she's accused of sexual immorality, and that she's saying Zeus impregnated her and that Dionysus is an offspring, a son of God. They deny his son of godship, which is why he brings revenge, not only on behalf of his mother.
I got to jump in there because Derek, it's all about economics and legal ownership of land and property. It's all about lineage. If you can say that you're of an illegal sexual union, right? Sexual immorality. Morality is a human construct. It's just a legal construct. Right. We create it, right? One man's immorality is another man's freedom fighting, whatever. We create it. So immorality of a sexual nature is nothing more than you are not of the lineage. You are not legally there to inherit the property, inherit the kingship, inherit the power. And that's why they're messing with this. They're playing with this in the mythologies. Both the Dionysus and the Jesus narratives are saying, oh, we are self-created. We are of the Father of the heavens, and the woman is immaterial. So you may think that it's sexually immoral, but no, it's a virgin birth. No, it's a direct transmission. And I am the legal inheritor of the power, of the kingship, of the rule, of the land, of whatever it is. And so it's very much a patriarchal trope, an economic, legal patriarchal trope, dressed in morality, which ideologies do.
Of course.
That's their bread and butter.
I just was thinking, what if the woman that he's fighting on behalf of is his mother in this scene in John 8, I believe it is, where he is on behalf of, I know this is totally scandalous to the Catholics.
But hey, I'm right here. I'm here for
it. I know, right? Like, I'm just like, what if this Mary who commits this sin, one is Mary Magdalene, right? But this is... she seems to be a fictional character in a story. If you take this approach,
nobody knows what to do with Mary Magdalene, do they? No,
right. What if she's his mom? I'm saying, like Eros Gamos, I think it is the Greek term for the incestual kind of relation that you find in the Egyptian, where it's sister brother or mother son. This is a common theme in Greek and Egyptian. Who's to say it's not here?
And why incestuous? Because that's where the divine purity comes from. And that's how you know that and this is why incest in the royal family was so important for the Egyptians. This is how you know they are of God. They are of the divinity. You have the purity of the bloodline, which goes to the patriarchal agricultural revolution too. But this idea that Atum creates himself, and then you have the birth of Shu and Tefnut. Their brother and sister have sex with each other. They create Geb and Nut. Their brother and sister, they have sex with each other. They create Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys. They're all brother and sister and have sex with each other. This is divine procreation. So if you want to be a human who presents themselves as divine, like Horus, like Jesus, like Imhotep, then it would be really nice to add a little incestuous little something something in there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
like it gives you pedigree in the mythology of the world and saying, hey, here we're running up. Here's our game in town, and ours is better. I mean, it's the same theme I've been saying over and over. Why did Jesus turn water into wine? Because that happened for real, and all the others are fake. Or is it, hey, dude, my guy is going to do better than your guy? And in fact, in most of the stories or the traditions, there's 3 jars in Dionysus, and they're bronze. And that's a whole nother spiel I won't get lost into, but there's 6 in Jesus's case in John chapter 2. Let's double the miracle. Let's double. So, but you have to
It's
work.
Also a prosperity miracle. It's a prosperity miracle. He's just made money. He made money.
Over 100 gallons of wine. Yep.
Right. That's a lot of money. So it's like you went to Vegas and you did your little prayer and all the slot machines worked for you. It's like that's a money miracle. This is where prosperity gospel comes from. It comes from the agricultural revolution. It comes from this divinity in the midst of that. So yeah, it's and in what context? In the context of 11 people who have been occupied by the Roman Empire, who feel their power has been taken out of their grasp, and that this historical Jesus is trying to explain how he will bring prosperity back to their own systems of power again. Mm-hmm. And that is a revolutionary thing for people to say. When you have a revolution, and there are many people that put historical Jesus into a revolutionary context, you're going to make that revolution about resources. The overlords have taken our money, they've taken our land, they've colonized us, they've occupied us. And
I mean, look at the theme of the Gospels. It's always the poor that are targeted. It is the weak. It is the less. Yeah. So they're getting this hope, right? It's like, here's this hope for you that you're going to overcome. And it's so funny watching even modern Christians read these passages where Jesus says, sell everything you own, come follow me. And like, Jesus was actually pro. He had rich followers. Dude, that message is clearly telling this dude to sell everything he has. So like, I guess what I'm beginning at is this seems like they're trying to fight the system of Rome and their power, but Christianity just ended up becoming one of the same. If there was anything noble originally in that, it seems that it got like lost in translation over time, where we can now own everything we want and yet still be good Christians. Whereas if this idea is the world is bad, some type of Platonic idea, or cynical, where we need to just like grab our staff, don't even bring money with you, just go and survive. Like that got lost along the way with most Christians. Maybe the monks took it to heart and went and lived in the caves and talked about, let this lust in my mind be gone. And you know what I mean? Like, I don't know. Like, I don't know what to do with it all. It's just crazy.
It is, but any ideology as it's created is going to be created in the crucible of its historical and social context. So if this is what's demanded of, and it's going to be complicated, right? Because there are parts where Jesus is actually a money-making miracle machine and health machine, right? He's the miracle God, and all of those things that you really want can be there. And yet at the same time, there is that social criticism. But if you look at it within the context of the Roman Empire, you can see the fat man not fitting through the eye of the needle as the collaborator with the Roman Empire, who shouldn't be there, right? And the water into wine is also returning sovereignty of the land, the vines, the grapes, the wine, back to the people who should have it. So you can see it in that anti-authoritarian, anti-empire context as well, if you take a more Marxist perspective. It's crazy.
It may not. And then there have been scholars who've highlighted some of that. I mean, like, why is he gathering fishermen from this lake that just got renamed to Lake Tiberias when it was this, just little lake of Galilee? It gets taxed now. Now you have tax collectors over here telling how many fish you have. Like, there's been scholars who pointed out when the empire started gaining and trying to take total control, Jesus is a form of a protesting revolutionary, and yet he's a problem for them. And there's some clever little pickles he gets out of in his engagement with Jews, according to the story as it unfolds. Should we pay taxes? Well, he says yes, and he just, like most of his constituency, as John Dominic Cross would say, would leave him. Like, oh, you're just a sellout. You just give in to the Romans. And then the other side is like, if he says no, he would be arrested then and there, or they would have tried to have him immediately killed, because now he's a revolutionary against Rome and he's trying to fight them. So he comes up with a clever little like word salad way out of this. Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar. You see that image? That's Caesar. Give that to him. Give to God that which is God. Well, great job. You know what I mean?
I think the reason it's so confusing that he can be a prosperity gospel at the same time he's there in favor of the poor is because Jesus's philosophies, as they're presented to us in the Gospels and many of the letters written thereafter, they never leave the realm of the patriarchal. So it's one patriarchal system versus another patriarchal system, which means that it will always ultimately be about commodifying women, poor men, laborers, children. It will also always be about hoarding land, lineage, and resources, but it's about who gets it. And so it's, you know what it reminds me of? It's like when I'm dealing with Afrocentrism within Egyptology, and Afrocentrists are saying, oh, all of this Egyptian stuff, it comes from an African core source, and I'm going to prove it. But it comes from a space of competitive patriarchy. And so it's just fighting fire with fire, and we're all burned. We're all singed. And what's the point? So, you know, I'm not saying that Jesus wasn't saying speak up for the poor, but Jesus isn't saying he does say look out for the women and children. There are some anti-patriarchal messages in there, but it's not the core of the teaching. At least it's not the core of the teaching the gospel writers give us. It's a very patriarchal story. And
or that's even the women be silent. The letters.
Yes, I mean that's going to be there in Paul later on, right? But that's still and the women do have tremendous power in the Gospels. It is absolutely true. In the same way that they do in the Egyptian mythologies, they're there to protect and contain and heal and wrap and all of those things. I mean, if I may make that comes to mind, another comparison between Isis, Horus, Osiris, and then the Jesus mythology is Mary then taking him off the cross and wrapping him in the shroud and burying him. And the women are the ones who do that. This is very much like the Egyptian mythology of the Isis story and what she does with Osiris. So there's so many things there, but because they're all mixed up, it's very hard to even say what the historical Jesus was.
Of course.
And what his point was, because it's confused with, again, a Greek tradition with an Egyptian tradition with the Mesopotamian Levantine tradition, and good luck to you. And Jewish tradition. I mean, my God. So it's all very, very complicated.
Lucian of Samosata, I recently got the book on Audible. I've been listening to a lot of books, reading a lot of books lately, and diving deep. And he has one about how to write history. And he is so anti-historians of his day, writing middle second century period. He's so against historians who are mixing in legend, myth, fable with history. He said, you guys are committing an unforgivable sin, pretty much, because the future generations will not be able to distinguish what happened from what you are embellishing and creating like these flowerful narratives. And some scholars I talk to they don't even think the Gospels are intentionally trying to write a narrative that is meant to be literal history or any way to be read as a mixture of. That's their approach. They think these are cultic, mythic texts that are portraying a narrative, a deified story about Jesus. And others are saying, what's a mix, right? The majority, I would say, of scholars try and go, it's like this mixture. But if you read Euripides, it is taking place in the real world, in Thebes, a real city that is fictional. So you have real world elements in the Gospels, but it's very fictional. What's going on? Yeah, it's everyone's guess, right?
What are we trying to do? What was this human endeavor to take a historical Jesus and transform him? You are taking humanity and turning it into divinity. And thus you must do that. You must have the miracles. You must have the connections with divinity that people know, that are touchstones for them. So you can say, oh, this historical guy is like this God. The Egyptians did this with this dude named Imhotep, right? You know him from the mummy movies and such. He was the architect of the first monumental structure built in all of humanity that we know of. It's called the Step Pyramid. It was built around 2700 BCE at Saqqara. And the statue of the King Djoser tells us that Imhotep did build this, that he was the one responsible for it. He's an elite guy. We know nothing about this dude. Yeah. And yet in Greco-Roman Egypt, this Imhotep is divinized. People create shrines to him. They are prayers to him and hymns in his service. He is a healer divinity. And so where is the historical Imhotep? We can't expect it to be there. They're not going to preserve it. They barely talk about the step pyramid at all in these texts. It's about his abilities to heal. So when you're talking about that fulcrum between divinity and humanity, you want to create authenticity with some ideas of a living person, because that makes it real. Then it means a human can be divine, right? Otherwise it can't happen. So you need those elements, but you're bringing in the divinity more than anything else. That's what it's about. It's about the miracle. It's not about what the guy, as you say, ate for breakfast on September 4th. Yeah,
exactly. What are they using these for? Right.
Yeah.
It's and what you've said today been very interesting. Someone might walk away and say, well, you haven't exposed the hidden roots of Christianity, as if like they need a genetic connection. I always wrestle between how much of this is possibly directly influencing some of the narrative creations, and some of it makes me wonder, like, it is influencing it, but is it being filtered through a Hellenistic lens that is happening over here, and I don't know, is being mixed along the way?
One way that apologists try to take down these connections, which are so obvious to everyone who's looking at an Isis holding the Horus baby and Virgin Mary holding the Jesus baby. It's so obvious to anyone, right? You can see it, you can feel it, it's there. But the way a Christian dogmatic apologist would take it down is they would say, but there's no one-to-one connection. It's not that thing going to that thing. And if you can't see it, then it didn't
If you
happen.
can't prove that one-to-one, your whole task is forsaken, of course, in their minds.
But that's not the way people work. So if you see a style that Britney Spears has rocked and you're like, I love that outfit that Britney Spears has worn, you're going to create your own version of it. You're not going to do it exactly this way. You're going to come up with your own permutation of it. You're going to add your own flair to it. You have a different body and a different hair color, or maybe a different gender. It depends on what you're doing, but it's not, you're never going to have one-to-one connections. In addition, we're talking about 5,000 to 7,000 years of mythology that's all feeding into this. And you're talking about geographies that are far removed in time and space, linked together by empire, a very large empire, which is able to link places as far removed as Central Asia all the way to Spain, and then into the New World, right? Once Christianity starts to spread and you have a different colonization and a different imperial overlord. But it's a lot. 5,000 to 7,000 years of human mythology is going to get problematic, and different understandings of geography are going to get problematic, which is why we use an evergreen fir of Northern Europe as a tree to represent Christ's birth, even if you're now, because of the way it's been commercialized and all of these things.
Yeah.
Even if you're in a place where, where an evergreen would never be, but this is the way it works. So just think of the Christmas tree and when it was created and how it was created and how it was parsed through. That it has to be an evergreen. It's like, why an evergreen? And this is the kind of stuff that went into the creation of the Jesus narratives as well. And it's not going to be. It's a game of telephone. And you can't expect it to be anything else. Anyone saying, oh, but there's no one-to-one and this is unique. No, have the eagle's eye view, transcend that, and look for the broader comparisons. And then it's all there. Look for how the ideology is of use and how it works. And in the economic, legal, and environmental context that you're in. And then it all works. It's all there.
And there are, like scholars who pointed out, some one-for-one-ish type stuff that does have imitation. Even in the birth of Matthew, it echoes very closely. Richard C. Miller wrote this in his book called Resurrection and Reception in Early Christianity, where he shows Alexander the Great's birth, and it even has the Magi play a significant role in the story. The mother is impregnated by, I believe this is Zeus, and he avoids having sex with her until the sill is broken, and she gives birth to Alexander. And this is Philip of Macedon, Philip II, I believe. And there's elements in it that are so similar to what we find over here with Jesus's birth in Matthew. So he documents some of that stuff. And I agree. I think there's just bunch of information, bunch of different ideas that have just been tidal wave for millennia after millennia. So we do have Q&A because, Kara, you and I know we can go on and on and on. And this was just, Christmas is around the corner. This is just the birth of Jesus, and we didn't even get into like in complex resurrection.
We're just some complex mammals on the third rock surrounding the sun, dealing with some seasonality and some hoarded agricultural goods, trying to figure out what the ideology surrounding it is. Complicated.
Look, I love this time of the year, right?
Yeah.
I love this time of the year. There's just something magical, especially when I used to go to Cooperstown, New York, and it was snow, and there's a little Santa shed, and I went in there the first time, and he knew me by name. And my dad told me later, I told him, hey, my son's name's Derek. He's coming in. But I thought, how did you know my name? You know, I'm a kid. It's got magic all around it for me. And I don't want to ever take that away from people. You know, let's have fun, enjoy our celebrations and stuff. Be mindful.
Oh, but can I make a connection right there? Because you went all Santa Claus. So let's go to St. Nicholas, whose tomb is apparently, his coffin has just been discovered, and people are freaking out. And I'm seeing all kinds of cute memes about it. But
really,
St. Nicholas as a human being versus the Santa Claus with the weird rosy cheeks and stuff, and the puffy red suit and all of this that we've created, and the removal of somebody from Turkey, I think like near Izmir, Turkey or something, Anatolia, and moving him to far North America. And why and how does this happen? I mean, talk about a game of telephone and talk about a British imperial context in which Santa Claus is created. And you're like, oh, okay, I can. But you see a real human being. There was a historical Saint Nicholas who lived in Anatolia, who was a part of Christianity and was a martyr in his own way. And then he has a historical, authentic self, but his divinization, because Santa Claus is divinized. I'm sorry. He is absolutely divinized now.
For sure.
He knows what you're thinking, right?
Exactly.
So and he can heal, and he can give you, he's a prosperity God who can give you all kinds of beautiful things. So this human being has been divinized, and looking at Santa Claus historically and ideologically is a perfect comparison for the historical Jesus and the ideological Jesus. I think it's a great analogy.
He's the gift-giving god, like Osiris, Dionysus, bringing gifts.
And there's not as much baggage, right? Jesus has all the baggage because you have to accept Jesus in your heart and all the dogmatic.
Gonna go to hell.
And it's like, oh my, yes, you don't have as much hellfire. You just get coal. You just get coal with St. Nicholas. So it's
of course.
The stakes are lower.
Yeah. And I get what you're suggesting. Someone said no one thinks Santa Claus is actually divine. I haven't been paying attention to the chat. I've been having so much fun with you. I don't know. Maybe that.
I think Santa Claus has been effectively divinized. Whether you go and pray to him in a particular way, but I think writing your list and talking to Santa, which we all did, he's totally divinized. Don't tell me that practically Santa is not divinized in your monotheistic reality. Right.
Sorry. Yeah, but usually, mind you, though, the example you just gave is an interesting one, because if I ask, do you think that Osiris is a deity? Right, we're just a little step away from, is this a practical religion surrounding Santa or not? The way that little children and young people like me, I did talk to Santa, and I did kind of pray to him and ask
to Santa.
Right.
You pray to Santa.
Asking for those gifts and visiting him at the mall or wherever it might be to try and hopefully get the gift from this gift-giving God who has an ability that can get in every chimney. You know the list. And
parents go nuts trying to create this miracle mindset for the children, right?
We try to keep it alive.
Capitalist, because that's the setting in which we live. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So if you apply that one step further to someone like Osiris, Dionysus, any of these other stories that they would say are myths, and while they'll admit that people may have worshipped them and believed them throughout time, they don't bat an eye, and the same way we might look at Santa Claus, we would then apply the same thing to maybe another divinity. They apply that kind of logic there. But when it comes to their own,
no, we don't do that. What if we went to Egypt and we said to somebody in the 3rd century, do you think Imhotep is a god? And they would say, no, we don't think Imhotep is a god. Not like Osiris. He's different. We worship him and we pray to him and we have hymns, but he's not really a god. And they would probably argue with you too and say, well, he's not, and it's the intellectual who comes in and says, yes, but you have divinized Imhotep and he's a human person, but now you have these shrines to him. They're like, yeah, but he's still a human being. He's still a person. But it is a way of connecting divinity in the heavens with humanity on earth and bringing that divine stream, whether it's through Jesus or St. Nicholas or Imhotep. And whatever you want to call it or feel it's appropriate to call. The mechanisms are the same.
Is Mary a god? No and yes. Look at how she's prayed to. She is literally like, there's just so.
Yes, she is.
Practically, she's
absolutely.
Exactly.
When I was a Catholic growing up, the only space I felt safe to pray in was to the Mary statues, to be quite honest. So that gives you a little bit of my background. And so, yeah, she's absolutely the divine feminine in the Catholic Church. And thank God they kept her. They drove her out of the LDS reality, right? It's all
or even Protestants.
The lamb.
Protestants have really like downplayed her significance, of course.
Yeah. No divine feminine here.
Okay, we're gonna get a Q&A, so you don't hate me for all eternity and say, damn, every time we get on these shows. We do have 650-ish people who are watching.
Great.
So please consider joining Dr. Kara Cooney's class. This one is about creation mythology in ancient Egypt. It gets so juicy and fun, and you have so much energy in you, Kara. I love learning this stuff, but it really, there's so much as you're teaching that I'm like, I see that in the Bible. But this is way, way older. And what the heck? Because that's how my brain works, because I was this little fundy who just read his 66 books of the Bible. And, you know, that's all I had. So now I see all this, like, I'll see reflections and imitations, or at least something that is in the same vein. And I'm like, but this is 3,000, I'd at least say 2,000 years older than the biblical, at least. And we can get in all that.
As soon as you relinquish that you're not going to go to hell and you free your mind, you're able to learn so many different things. It's an extraordinary thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So before we go there, go sign up for her class. You can go right now and you'll own it for life. It is in high quality. She's going to be doing Zoom calls with students who sign up. If it's successful, we'd like to do this more often, where you can have her as your own professor. So you're like actually learning from an Egyptologist, and you'll be able to ask questions and stuff like that. So it'll be a lot of fun. You can also get some of her books that she has written. I was going to bring up, when you brought up the ancestral stuff about the good kings and how deformed, sadly, but still the deformity of some of these pharaohs. They can't even walk. They're physically deformed because of the ancestral stuff happening. Whoa. Reminds me of the European kings later that are doing this and like starting to get all sorts of deformities genetically. So, but that's not the only thing you talk about in this book. There's so much more. It's like one sentence, but I remember it. I'm like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, whenever you talk about kingship, you got to talk about incest. There's no way around it. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. Thank you so much. All right. Inspired One says, can you address which was older, Kemet or Mesopotamia? I think that the interesting part about that question is Kemet. Instead of just saying Egypt, why use the term Kemet?
I can tell you.
Okay.
Why. So the term Kemet is used because Egypt is a bastardization of a name for a temple in Memphis named Hut Ptah Ka. And that went into Greek as Egypt. And it's perceived as many people as a colonial imposition, an occupation by a Western force. And they are in some ways right. However, Egypt is a made up name. I get it. I feel your dissatisfaction with the moniker Egypt. However, Kemet means the Black Land, and it is limiting the land of Egypt to the Nile Valley and only the Nile Valley. And it's not talking about the desert. It's not talking about the cataract region to the south. So I don't think Kemet describes the full Egyptian picture that you're going for. It is, however, a word that the Egyptians used to describe their agricultural space where most of the people live. So there's nothing wrong with Kemet. But
I just didn't know.
It's just not satisfactory in terms of describing Egypt as we know it. It wouldn't include like a Greco-Roman Egypt with Alexandria, in my opinion, for instance.
Got it. I brought you in close too. So, okay, some people say Mesopotamia is, at least writing and civilization in that sense, is older. But can we even safely say which is really older? Because they're both going from a non-written oral societies into more written. Are they both old as hell? Like, how do you even distinguish? Would you say writing came first in Mesopotamia, though? And then, like,
These arguments get really they go deep into the weeds, and they involve carbon dating of wood from certain sites at Buto in the Delta and Ur in Mesopotamia, and connecting to texts that really we're talking about texts arriving in both places around 3500 BCE in both places. Now, Mesopotamia does have more evidence to suggest that it's a little bit older. How much older from the evidence? Like a couple 100 years, 100 years, 50 years. This is what come on. And this is the evidence that we have right now. And evidence is there's always new evidence to be found by archaeologists. So when we're talking about the granularity of a couple 100 years for something that happened 5,000 years ago, the first texts, first written texts, I'm gonna be like, look, they're both about the same age, and let's calm down and say that the oldest steps towards the agricultural revolution and towards complex civilization with scare quotes would be in Anatolia, the Fertile Crescent as defined by archaeologists of the past, but parts of Syria, parts of Jordan, and Anatolia, and looking at places like Çatalhöyük and Göbekli Tepe, where you have people gathered together in large numbers without agriculture, which is super shocking. And you should read the book by David Wengrow and David Graeber on early human history and how maybe everything you thought about the agricultural revolution was wrong. It was just certainly very, very interesting. But I'm not gonna try to hit that question. I don't think it's the right question for me to ask as a scholar, which is older, Kemet or Mesopotamia, Egypt or Mesopotamia. But it's really interesting that you have elites starting to monopolize power, wealth, and land in both places simultaneously, and that they're in communication with each other. And you can prove that they're in communication with each other. So yeah, once it's on, it's on.
Thank you. Stop scamming, man. Good to see you here. It's been a minute since I've streamed. I think the fact Isaiah was mistranslated into Greek as predicting a virgin birth and efforts to make Jesus look like a fulfiller of prophecies has far more explanatory power over this than Greek myth. So the idea, okay, so if I'm understanding,
parse this for me. Please help me understand.
Yeah.
This is again coming from your subculture.
Yeah.
I need to know.
Matthew's gospel has a prophecy they're saying that Jesus is fulfilling from Isaiah 7:14.
Right.
And that is that a virgin will conceive. The way Matthew describes it, the term that they use is a virgin. And in the LXX, or if you will, really the LXX, I think does translate it as virgin, but it's the Masoretic, if I'm not mistaken, the Hebrew has it as a young woman. She could be a virgin, but that's not the term that you would use, right? So either way, she's a young maiden. But the idea of, so it's saying as mistranslated into Greek as predicting a virgin birth and efforts to make Jesus look like a fulfiller of prophecies has far more explanatory power over this than Greek myth. I think this limits the scope of either or. Just recently reading a commentary by Tim Whitmarsh, for example, on Achilles Tatius, understanding this Dionysus myth that Michael Jones, and you're going to want to see this interview that I've got coming up, where he thinks this actually is the first myth that Dionysus turns water, here we are into the molecular level of specifics, turns water into wine. Well, when I was reading this commentary, every single sentence in Achilles Tatius is imitating and reflecting like 4 or 5 different things at once. And he is highlighting how creative this author is, that he isn't just pulling from one stream. He is mishmash, and as a brilliant author, pulling in from various sources. That's why I'm open to the Egyptian aspect, while even thinking Matthew is imitating Alexander the Great's birth. And who else is imitating Alexander the Great's birth is Augustus, which we find a clear narrative of that in Suetonius. And this is the same deity. Like, there's so many cool things you could find in terms of this. But is it only looking at Isaiah 7:14 when we're thinking of this? Or is it pulling from a richer, more contemporaneous pool of Hellenistic thought while pulling from scripture, while potentially being inspired from elsewhere? And I think it's easier to explain, like you're saying, this is prophecy, look to scripture. That's much easier to do. That's exactly what apologetics capitalizes on with me. Derek, you need to show me a text in the New Testament that quotes Egyptian mythology, that quotes a Greek myth. Like, I need a direct one for one to be, I'm not saying that's what you're doing, Scamming Man, but I'm just saying that's like, it's easier for anyone and everyone to see the Gospels are clearly imitating Jewish scripture. Where you have to turn up your thinking in terms of being open to seeing more is realizing they are pulling from a much richer cultural aspect than just Jewish scripture. And at every turn, Jesus is an elbow to Jewish law. He's an elbow to Moses. He is not just like, oh, I'm just following Moses. He's breaking from Moses and doing something even bigger and newer. And I think that there's just so much more here. Sorry, I went on the little rant, but that's my little thing there. It could just be that she was a virgin, that they thought this prophecy back here was a virgin, because I think the Greek indicates that in the LXX, but
no, and I know of this debate, but I'm not going to try to hit it. It's not my world. But can't two things be true at the same time, right? So yeah, it doesn't mean that one doesn't work, as you say, multiple streams. Yeah.
I think there's a lot more going on here, clearly. Apollo's Christian Apologetics, thank you for the super chat, my friend. Clarification: Nicaea was the Arian controversy, not Bible books. A universal canon came later. Overall, point still stands, but just friendly note.
Thank you. I'm a simple Egyptologist.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's all good.
It is. But we know some men chose the
fact
text,
that it comes
though.
even later is great. I like that even better. So it's good. It's fine.
Yeah, I mean, again, certain guys chose certain texts and like made sure that those were good, and these are heresies, and these texts start to get ruled out and not counted. It happens at some point, whenever, earlier or later, doesn't matter. It's still something that you would say, well, who made that decision-making process? And
also, if you're deciding what's heresy and what's not, then certain books are going to be appropriate and certain books are not, right? So it's going to help you with your inclusion versus exclusion. But again, not my area of expertise.
Yeah, of course. Stop Scamming Man again. Thank you for the super chat. The Moabites used sarcophaguses a number of times. Are there any cases of Israelites or their apparent precursors using them?
Yeah. I have a whole book behind me about pottery coffins and from places like Tel Yehudia and other places that are there on the margins between the Egyptian and Levantine lands. And some of these pottery coffins, which would have, they seem like they're of lesser quality than a wooden Egyptian coffin or stone sarcophagus, but they're, to bake one of these in a kiln would have taken a tremendous amount of charcoal. These are expensive objects, and some of them have a more naive sort of figural representation of the face, but others are painted and in more Egyptianizing type ways. But there is, in short, a real communication of how one treats the dead going between the Levant and Egypt. I mean, really, it goes far back, thousands and thousands of years, but certainly at the time of the Moabites as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Stop Scamming Man. Appreciate you. Chris Moore says, MythVision podcast, would a matriarchal society religion be just as susceptible with supremacist corruption the way Abrahamic religions did? If history went in another direction, just asking. Can I comment just and then let you take over?
Yeah.
If there's anyone in this household that I live in, by the way, my beautiful queen, MythVision, she benefits when you sign up for the course. You're helping all of us, and especially her, and of course, Dr. Cooney. But she has birthed 3 boys. Okay, so we're 4 boys in one house and 1 queen. The queen bee, I'm telling you, if it weren't for her, shit would not go well. The kids would be so jacked up with so many illnesses. I mean, like, I'm not saying I wouldn't do the best I could as a dad, but like, there's so many things, just even on a practical level, that she does that without it, we would be up the creek. What is that? How's it say? Without a paddle, like up Shit's Creek without a paddle. Something like literally. I'm not even joking. So I guess if you gave people who knew how to run shit a little bit better, a little more power. Anyway, go ahead, Kara. Go ahead.
Okay, so to ask about a matriarchy or a matriarchal society is to ask a question from within the matrix of a patriarchal society. It's the way we think. there would never be a matriarchal society. And even if women could rule, they wouldn't demand that there be a matriarchy, that only they get the power, because that's not the way a matriarchy could ever be set up. In other words, thinking that there might be a matriarchy is a patriarchal thought pattern. So that's number one. Number two, hunter-gatherers have all different ways of organizing society. And some of them give a lot of power to women. Some of them give very little power or no power to women and children. And so there's a huge variety of social systems. It doesn't mean whether you're pre-civilization with scare quotes, pre-agricultural revolution, that you would live in a place where women have everything equal. And I talk about this a lot more in my book, The Good Kings. And then, like, third, the way we've organized society with the agricultural revolution ultimately and completely excludes women and children from systems of power. And let me tell you what I mean by that. If you are trying to control, own, and pass down land and the grain that comes from it, the grain that you're able to produce and save, that's the hoarding part, in large amounts, then you've got to commodify women too. And the commodification and lack of social powers for women goes part and parcel with patriarchal economic systems. It's one reason why now that people are starting to act anti-patriarchally by not getting married, by not having children, by not engaging in traditional religious systems, and by not even participating in the gender binary that patriarchy demands, that people are losing their mind because it goes against our patriarchal economic systems. So the woman's body has to be commodified to produce as many children as possible, to staff a farm, to protect it, to get the labor for that farm. And women, I'm so sorry, and I do this in my class, Women in Power in the Ancient World, for any women listening or sensitive men, that women are very much treated like cattle in agricultural systems, and we can't expect anything different. And if you look around the world today, you look at wealthy people and how women are treated, they are only valued as young producers of the next generation. They are not valued as older women. Older women are discarded, not listened to, distrusted. Older men are the shit, and we love them. So that's it, because they have the power in the patriarchal system. This is a very short answer to a very complicated topic. And if you want to know more about this, I would definitely look at my book, The Good Kings, where I go into more detail about what I think patriarchal systems are, what kinds of system of leadership they can and do create, and what I think is coming in the future with what I believe is the beginnings of a new anti-patriarchal revolution that we find ourselves in right now. So yeah, stay tuned. But you've asked a very, very big question. We are now going, you're asking, can history go in another direction? That's happening now. We're at the very beginnings of it. It's happening now.
I think it was even kind of going like, what would it, it's a hypothetical, but like, what would it have looked like if it did go the other direction,
like if
right?
the Germans had won World War II, right? It's not a battle. That's a patriarchal way of thinking of it. The men can produce 365 babies out of their body and still go to work all at the same time. Women produce the baby in their body. That biological difference means the woman is commodified. I just wrote a whole article about body power if you would like it. It's published. It's in an open source volume with Brill, and it's in a power volume. You'd have to look for my formal academic name, Kathleen M. Cooney, Kathleen with a Y. And I think I'm going to put it on my ResearchGate and my academia.edu. But it's really like laying out how, because of the mechanisms of birth, breastfeeding, caretaking, how a woman is commodified and exploited by patriarchal systems systematically. And why in feminist culture, one of the main ways of escaping such systematic exploitation is to refuse to participate, refuse to get married, refuse to have children. And why one of the pushbacks is to re-ideologize and these systems, make women give birth, make abortion illegal, control their bodies, and put them back into that subservient, exploited position. So that's why we're at the beginnings of an anti-patriarchal revolution, and there is a pushback against those choices that people are making in the grassroots of society. It's a very interesting question you've asked, and I could obviously talk about it for a long time.
No, there's a lot there. Thank you. Mr. Monster, thank you for becoming or renewing your membership. I think at one point you were also a member of the YouTube channel, and I want to get back into these streams. I want to start doing this more again. This is my passion. I love communicating. I love having these dialogues and learning from the scholars, like live right there, and you get to ask questions and stuff. So I really do appreciate it. You'll have that special symbol next to your name as you see on the screen there. I don't know if that's like YouTube chooses that symbol and we don't really have any say, but thanks again for being a member and supporting what we're doing. Mushroom Farmers Guild, again, thank you for becoming a member. I don't think I've seen you as a member before, but you may have it. I don't know. It's good to see you joining as well. And thank you for being a member of our channel. Stop Scamming Man. Seth seems to be kind of an a-hole, yet there were pharaohs named after Seth. Seti. Did they also have nicer portrayals of Seth in regard to the feud with Osiris?
This is such a great question. Seth is complicated. So it's not until the 7th century, 6th century BC that Seth is treated as this demon devil type figure. And the Egyptians send out chisel bearers to remove reliefs and names of Seth. In the New Kingdom, late bronze, Seth he's a storm god. There we've got our Egyptian Levantine connection, right? He's a storm god. He's a god of rain coming from the heavens. He's a god of raging. He's a god of lightning and thunder, and a god of violence. And violence is needed. Sometimes you have to get angry, right? Sometimes, what do they tell you? You go to your therapist, they're like, anger is not bad. It's what you do with it, right? So you need to have that archetype of masculine violence. And Seth is the archetype of masculine violence. And he is so needed, so necessary, that the sun god speaks up for him when you have the contendings of Horus and Seth and they're trying to decide who will be the next king. The sun god is like, I love him. He's my guy. He protects me from Apophis, who is trying to create decreation every night. So I need him to violently spear that chaotic violence that is coming at me every day, so that the Egyptians understood that Seth was not a demon. He was a masculine violence that needed to be properly propitiated and controlled, and that many Egyptians, particularly East Delta and Levantine Egyptians, connected with in a very special way. And indeed, in the 19th dynasty begins with a group of men, probably generals and men who had found their way to power through a military industrial complex, if you like. And they were named Ramses, Ra has borne him, Ra-Mesu, and Seti, the one of Seth, the one who is associated with Seth. And so, yeah, you've got all these kings with the name Seti. Is that a problem with the Osiris mythology, you ask? And indeed it was. So the king Seti the First has this drop dead gorgeous temple at a place called Abydos, also pronounced Abydos, in Middle Egypt on the Nile Valley. And in that space, he cannot write his name with the Seth animal, with the ears and the forked tail. He has to write his name with a different sign. And he actually uses the teat knot, which is associated with protection and the god Isis. He uses that as like a way of writing his name without writing his name. And there are other hieroglyphs that are used instead. But Seti obviously knows that in the birth and death place where Osiris's burial was thought to be, and where he was worshipped as a dead god of the underworld at Abydos, Seti built a temple that was primarily dedicated to the god Osiris. And his name was such a problem that he had to write it in a different way. So and in his tomb as well, he had to come up with cryptographic ways of writing his name. So this is a really, really fun question. But also understand that, and I did an episode on this in a documentary I did ages ago called Out of Egypt, which you can actually still buy on, I don't get any money from it, doesn't matter, but you can get it on Amazon. And I did Prime. One on religion and violence, I did that one, but I also did one on the birth of the devil. The concept of the devil is very new. It's not something that people created until, you could argue that it's Christianity that created this idea of the devil. And we do that in the documentary. I talked to a historian of early Christianity, and he walks me through all of this stuff. But human beings saw gods violent power as trickster gods, as gods of might and strength. And they didn't denigrate them. They didn't try to make them, to remove them from their pantheons. They embraced them. They gave offerings to them. It's only very recently, I would say in the last couple thousand years, that we have a problem with such divinities. And any of you listening who might be Hindu in background know that there's divinities that can be very violent, and they have temples, and you try to propitiate them and connect with them. And a lot of indigenous religions have no concept of a devil, and there's no problem with that. This idea of putting all divinity into all good or all bad baskets, I think, has caused humanity a lot of problems. And it also makes the Hebrew Bible God of Yahweh very problematic, because he's always an a-hole. And how do you deal with that when God is coming at you with that kind of ferocious vigor, and yet he's not a devil because you put good and bad in the same divinity? It's kind of nicer when you have one God who's doing trickster violent things and another God who's doing other things. It helps you to deal with these issues. Yeah. But I'm a polytheist myself, but you guys have to deal with this one in a monotheistic reality.
You mean
you're asking a question from he's asking a question from a monotheistic perspective, in short. Right. The same way you're like, oh, that's a patriarchal question. Well, we swim in this water. It's hard to you can't get out of the water. We're the fish in the water. So how are you going to do it? But he's asking a question from a monotheistic perspective.
Right. Exactly. Well, I think that's the majority of my audience.
We all do.
Even I can't help the bias that I come from is you can see the tendencies of me reacting to my upbringing, to my earlier beliefs.
We all do. We have to decode and
of course.
What's the word? But I have to do it all the time too. We all have to do it.
Yeah. It's our reference point, and we're trying to come out of that, learn and expand our understanding. I'd love to get into the rabbit trail of Seth and how he gets understood and how he even becomes polemical, like this character Seth, this deity with Yahweh later in a very evil sense, because that's a whole nother discussion.
Seth and Yahweh are the same God from a historical archaeological perspective. That's that's the way it works. Setech and Yahweh, these things were interchangeable before you get the Yahweh cult to come in and sweep all of that aside. So
interesting. Okay, we've got to do something down the road on this, because the attributes and characteristics, we should get into some of that. Hang Fashi, thank you so much for the super chat. I will never look at halos the same again. And this is back when you were talking about how Horus is taking Seth's ejaculation, and then so what is a halo? Just again, what is that halo? The sun disk?
Yeah. So it's when they called the semen forth. They're like, semen of Seth, come out, come out. And because he had ingested it, Isis had tricked him and put it in his lettuce, it came out as a sun disk on his head, and that he snatches away. But yes, that is where I think the halo comes from, this sun disk idea. But it is an aura. It is an idea of a human. The halo is great because, yes, it's semen in this sense in the Egyptian story, but it really rounds out what we're talking about, which is how do you make the human divine, or how do you see a connection between the human and the divine? And when we pictorialize it, we'll show a human being with arms and legs and a head and all of these human things, but then we got to show their divine. So you put this halo there, this sun disk, this connection with divinity, with the heavens. Is there an Egyptian one-to-one connection with that? I can't prove it, but maybe. I'd have to go through a lot of data and try to find the first instance of a halo and see, does it look like a sun disk? Is it the same size? That's some interesting scholarly work that somebody could do. Yeah.
Apollo, I know Apollo in very early Greek art has that. So that'd be a fun rabbit trail. Stop Screaming Man, thank you again. Are there any Egyptian myths which resemble the story of Moses' infancy, like Sargon's myth does? That's why I said earlier, like the whole how Isis hides the infant in the Nile. What are the plants?
They're the reeds. Yeah. That's the best. That's the best mythology. Is this? Oh, sorry, hit my camera. That's the best mythology. This notion of hiding the child, hiding Horus. So Horus is really, really there. I don't know if there's a human that fits that that mythology of a child that had to be hidden? I don't think so. It is more divinity and divine children, divine male children. The feminine children are never, there are no little girls. They become, they're born, and then they're all of a sudden ready to have babies in the mythologies. But
Oh my gosh.
the male gets to be a child. Isn't that interesting? That you don't have the female child.
No wonder men are immature compared to.
I mean, and you know, I was talking to my grad class about Seth being an a-hole, as I think the same questioner asked before. And Seth, there is a wonderful theory. This might stop people in their tracks. That you know, the Seth animal with the ears and the snout, and then the
I'll get an image for people.
End. Yeah. So that I read an article some 20 years ago, a series of articles in a magazine that was a popular magazine that is now defunct because we don't do magazines anymore. That was called Kemet, KMT, to shout out to the previous questioner. And they were proving that Seth, the animal, this mythological animal, is not an aardvark. It's not like some other creature. There you go. That he is a giant dick, if I may.
Oh, really?
Yes, that the authors, and sorry, I can't remember their names, and I have just pulled these articles so I can share them with you later. But they took the glands, the entire glands of a bull, including penis, testicles, and the whole glandular apparatus that goes into the bull, removed it from the bull, pinned it to a wall, and it's got these ears, these flappy ears, and the penis is, of course, the snout of the nose, and the gland does end in this weird forked
no
thing.
Way.
So when you're talking about Seth acting the way that he acts as that a-hole, you are talking about toxic masculinity. You are talking about men thinking with their dicks. You are
the original dick.
The original dick. And can this absolutely be proven? But I think that the research is there, and it's a wonderful bioarchaeological question of whether or not Seth is just a giant penile gland.
That needs to be a meme. Someone make that go viral, please. That was amazing.
Yeah,
oh my god,
pretty cool.
That is pretty freaking cool. And one comment just to say, like, of course, this is any and every agricultural society, but like, bulls were a big deal in Egypt. Okay, so they probably dissected them quite often, or at least.
They knew that the Apis bull cult was a real deal, and we still have the mummification table for that. It's massive, and they would have eviscerated these animals. They would have known all of the anatomy, and the Egyptians were the medical experts of the day because they knew anatomy so well because of what mummification demanded. So they would have, and from early days, because Seth shows up in the pyramid text. He shows up before the pyramid text. Seth makes his first appearance around 3200, 3000 BCE, maybe 3000, maybe it's first dynasty when he makes his first appearance. I'll have to check, but it's early, and it's pre-pyramid text. And we're talking about African bull cults. Everyone knows their anatomy when they're dealing with this kind of stuff, right?
Thank you so much. Wade Rogers, thank you for the super chat. A relief shows Ahmos before Amon holding the Ankh to her nostrils. She inhales the breath of life, then appears in her bedchamber and overshadows her. Luke 135, the Holy Ghost, Pneuma, breath, will overshadow you.
Oh, how cool. That's so cool. And Derek, do you have that Akhenaten image that I sent you too?
Yes. Let me just get one off the internet. I know exactly which image.
That's totally fine. Yeah. So we didn't talk about the divine birth of kings, did we? Though I know that a lot of your Christian apologists are dealing with that and saying, no, that can't be like what the divine birth of Jesus was, et cetera, et cetera. But the divine birth of Egyptian kings is represented twice. Once for Hatshepsut and once for Amenhotep III, and it shows and this isn't that. So
this isn't the image you sent.
This is not. This is the later image. So, but what I'm talking about now is I'll get to that. But the divine birth, if you put in divine birth and put in Amenhotep III, I bet you would find it.
Okay, you're gonna have to help me with that spelling.
Sorry. Amenhotep, pretty much like you hear it. HOTEP, and then 333 or 111.
There.
There we go. And so there, that second one, that's perfect. So there you do have the god Amun-Re holding the Ankh symbol of life. Yeah, I know, you have to make it bigger. Holding the Ankh symbol of life to her nostrils. The Egyptians did not like to show procreative sex in their imagery. It was not something that they showed, but they would instead show it as the life going towards the force of one creature or entity going towards the life force of another creature or entity. Exactly.
Is this the one?
You've got, this is, so you have on the left, the goddess receiving life, receiving the semen, receiving the seed of the god. And then the god on the right, Amun-Re. And here we have, this is really divine birth in a nutshell, even though I know your Christian apologists are saying it's not. He's the one that's creating the life. She is receiving. She is not the one in this text that is creating it on her own. It's him that's putting the life towards her, and then she's just the vessel that's receiving it, certainly pictorially. And notice how they're held up aloft by divinities. Those divinities are putting them into the realm of the heavens. So this is a divine thing. Again, answering that question, how do you have a human being who is part divine and part human, who can die and yet be of divinity? Well, you have a god inseminating a woman and putting her into this divine realm when she is inseminated. And it is absolutely a divine birth where she is just the vessel. And I love that this idea of overshadowing, you know, I have to look at the word of the text. So I would have to go through and see if there's an overshadowing there. And we are going to read in my graduate seminar, we are going to read a lot of things from Luxor Temple in the winter quarter. So I'll get back to you and see what that word is for how the Ankh life actually moves into her body. But if you go to the Akhenaten one, that I told you to put up first.
Let me find that.
Started talking about something else. I'm so sorry.
Is that the first, the one you told me that, or the other one?
No, the first one that you put up.
Okay.
Yeah, if you just put in Akhenaten, you'll get Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and you'll get it. Perfect. That's it. So here you see something very similar, but for everybody, and it's the sun god who. Remember, Akhenaten tells us that all gods are one and all gods are the Aten. And he is, in some Egyptologists' understanding, a monotheist. Whether that word is appropriate or not, we won't talk about here.
You and I can get into that.
We can do it another time. But that god, that masculine god, is inseminating everybody. The Ankh is going to everybody's nostrils, and all of the new life comes from that god. And then you see Akhenaten holding what looks to be his eldest daughter, and in a very sexualizing way. This is something that I argue for. This is something that other Egyptologists do not argue for, but he's got his hand between her legs. If you give it a little closer look, and he's kissing her full on the lips. This is extraordinarily strange to see. It is way too intimate in my personal opinion to be anything but a sexual encounter. And we know that Akhenaten elevated two of his daughters to great royal wife, just as his father Amenhotep III had done before him. And I think that Tutankhamun, who we know from genetic tests recently done, that he was a product of incest, and there is no evidence that Nefertiti or Kia were sisters. I think that Akhenaten created, and I published this in my book, When Women Ruled the World, I think that Tutankhamun created that Akhenaten created his son Tutankhamun with a father-daughter incestuous relationship. And I see that here in front of me. So that Ankh is very much like a semen, masculine, creative, Holy Spirit. I don't know, kind of. It's very similar. Look at that. And then maybe, Derek, go to put in Holy Spirit, Virgin Mary, conception, and get some sort of medieval painting where you see the Holy Spirit coming like a shaft of light and hitting Mary in her belly. And it's a very similar image. And I understand it's a medieval image. You could probably find a much earlier. I don't know what the earliest image of the divine conception is in Christian art. Again, not my field. I'm an Egyptologist. It would be really interesting if someone has looked at that. I don't know.
The beams of light right onto her belly. I know there's some out there. I'll try and hunt that down. I also
and I'm sure people are Googling that right now and they're like, oh my God, I see that beam of light. And it's like the same angle and it's very cool. It's light. It is light that's being used to.
This is generic. This is totally generic. I'm trying to find something, but you can see even the light, right? It touches all of them on the right here.
Oh, wow. That's
of course.
Yes,
now,
yes.
I mean, I'm trying to find like impregnated, Holy Spirit impregnates
Put
Mary.
divine conception, that might do it. Immaculate conception, that also works.
I'm just gonna put beam. I'm putting all sorts of stuff in there. Oh, here's
there
one.
You go. Yes, perfect.
The light. Yep.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Interesting.
And it's very much like an Akhenaten, Aten,
Here's another one
sort of thing. And
that one's the dove.
It's perfect. Holy Spirit, and it goes with that patriarchal understanding that you have to have the male God create male God, and that's how it works. Aten creates Akhenaten, right? Father creates Jesus.
I was going to make a funny joke about the kid on the mom's lap pointing and going, hell no, mom, look. But you know what I mean? Like,
I know. I think
because she's like, what's going on?
And
they don't know better.
They're there as witnesses. They're like, this is a holy moment. It's represented as a holy, sacred moment.
Wow.
Of creating more divinity through this pure divine family. So
humans, man.
Yeah, humans they're interesting. They're interesting.
Okay, sorry I'm taking so much of your time. We're having a blast, obviously, but
good.
I don't want you to feel overwhelmed. So if you feel like speeding up, feel free to do whatever you feel.
You're good. You're good.
Hang Fishy, again, thank you so much. Did ancient Egyptians conceive of the Nile or represent water as a chaos water dragon goddess, like how Tehom Tiamat was represented in ancient Near Eastern and Judaism?
Sometimes yes, but not a goddess, rather a god. And they chose Sobek as the god of the inundation. There's multiple ways of representing the inundation, but Sobek is the flood and the violent flood. Sobek is the crocodile god who can snatch children from the riverbank. He is a god who must be propitiated. He is a god of violence and force, very much like Seth. And I do indeed want you to think of this in an Egyptian mindset rather than thinking of a goddess. I need you to think of this in a patriarchal way. This is an efflux. This is a giant ejaculation. And the Egyptians conceived of it in that way. And I talk about that in my class with Derek, that the Nile flood is this ejaculation. And so you want to see it as this powerful masculine entity, and the river banks, the container, as the feminine. So, which is really interesting because Hapi is also associated with fecundity and the Nile products. Hapi, if you could probably look for HAPY, Derek, and you'll be able to show everyone that Hapi is hermaphroditic. Hapi is part male and part female. He has pendulant breasts and a pregnant belly, but it's a male god with a kilt and obviously a penis underneath that kilt, we have to assume. But let's see if we can get some Hapi. And perfect. Yeah.
Would this be one or
and you can see that he's got like breastfeeding breasts and a big belly. And he's like male and female all together, very much like Akhenaten depicts his own body, I might say. Akhenaten shows himself as male and female simultaneously. I argue, Dorothea Arnold argues, other people. But anyway, to see the Nile as the Egyptians did, it's kind of like in the Hindu understanding of the lingam stone into the container, right? That you have the Nile efflux going into the banks, the container of the channel. That's the word I'm looking for. Which is very much like a birth canal. It's meant to be understood in that way. It is male and female put together. And Derek, can you put in there Tutankhamun lotus flower head?
There's a Tutankhamun.
Good. And then put lotus flower.
Lotus head?
Yeah, that'll do. There you go. And that is kind of like what I'm talking about. It's like the Nile flood is that. There you have Tutankhamun being born from a vaginal element. It's the masculine coming out of the feminine container. He is being birthed. And it's Not necessarily the way other people might see it, but you can compare that to the Nile question that we just had.
Again, it keeps bringing me back to like they're looking at the natural world. Of course, people will take advantage of where they can for their own selfish, desires, and of course set up systems so that is perpetual. But at the same time, they're looking at like just how things operate and function typically in terms of sexual activity. But then they go a step further and like make a man who's able to procreate himself, and it's like, when have you seen that happen, dude? Like, obviously that's a power move in the story, but anyway, so much there.
But that is also what Akhenaten is arguably doing. He's like, I am creating myself through sex with an extension of myself, right?
Right. I'm just thinking about the stories you get into in creation where like they eat their own semen and end up like, all this stuff that it's like, whoa. Daniel, thank you for becoming a member, or been a member now for 3 months. I really appreciate it. Does the Nephtheh relate to the Eucharist?
I don't know what that is. What's the Nephtheh?
Let me look that up.
Me too. If you can provide any more context, that would be good.
Nephtheh. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. Nephtheh. I see planets coming up. Okay. Dark, cold, whipped by supersonic giant Neptune. So, can you give me context, Daniel? I'm not sure what it is. Maybe I'll put Nephtheh Egyptian. I imagine. So Neptune comes up again.
I'm only finding stuff from video games.
There's Nephthys. There's Nephthys or
Nephthys. Nephthys. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. Was a goddess. So I don't know. Maybe just to nail Daniel's point down, and maybe Daniel's in the chat. Oh, Egyptian drink of sorrow. Is it this? Nepenthe? Egyptian drink of sorrow? I haven't heard of that. Let me type that in though over here. Egyptian drink of sorrow. A glimpse of ancient funerary practices. But it doesn't say that.
I have no idea. I've never heard of this. I'm so sorry.
Is there an equivalent? Let me ask you this: is there an equivalent Eucharist type?
And the interwebs have no. But
yeah, is there a Eucharist type thing where they digest the deity through a ritual of some sort of cornbread and beer? I've heard, or something like that.
I mean, you're always offering the gods bread and beer first. That's so if you're going to do a daily meal for the gods, which every temple needs to do, every temple needs to wake up the gods, do some incense, clear the air, play some music, and then start your offering of your meal. You might start your offering with milk because it's, you want to wake up the child god who's just been reborn. But then you want to offer bread and beer, wine to your divinity. You put all of these things on the altar for the god for them to consume. It's an interesting thing that we as Christians put the bread and wine on the altar so that we can consume it. The Egyptians put these things on the altar so the god could consume it, but then the offerings reverted to the priests and the people, and those things were then consumed by the people. So
I found it, by the way, just so you know. Sorry.
What is it? Let's see. Oh, it's in the Odyssey.
In the Odyssey, it says this, but it says it's a magical potion given to Helen by an Egyptian queen. It quells all sorrows with forgetfulness. So it's clearly not. Maybe somewhere in Egyptian lore somewhere.
Nepenthe. Okay.
Fictional medicine for sorrow. It's a fictional medicine for sorrow. So this clearly in Greek literature and Greek mythology, which is probably why I didn't raise any red flags for you.
So, and I wouldn't stress about looking for a one-to-one,
of course,
connection for anything that you consume in your body, because magical traditions globally have people consuming things for magical purposes, and the Eucharist is a magical spell. If you don't do it in the right order, in the right way, you won't get Jesus into the bread. Right?
Well, you can die, Paul says.
Yes. you have to do it correctly, and you have to go according to the steps, right? If you do it right, then you create a Eucharist that has Jesus in it. And the ancient Egyptian magical texts that we have preserved have all kinds of consumption spells where you take it, you write something on it, you dissolve the ink in the beer, you drink the beer, and you have drunk the potency of that god or that word, that idea. And so consumption is a way of getting divinity or power into your body. And the Egyptians excelled at that kind of spellcraft. And wouldn't
you agree? That's why the Greeks could even use a fictional magical potion, because whether or not there really ever was one, they were known for magic spells and having these abilities and stuff.
Yeah.
So I imagine Greeks would, even in their own fiction, fictionalize about a potion or something that may not ever have been in Egyptian writings or anything like that. You know what I'm saying? Like, you could invent it even.
Everyone was looking to the Egyptians for what they considered the oldest. Herodotus, when he went to Egypt, said that Egyptians were the most religious of peoples. And so to understand how ideological power worked, how to connect with the gods, how to get a magical spell to function, Egypt was and still is considered the source to which you go to find this kind of power. So that's great. I'm glad you found it on Wikipedia. Good job.
Yeah, well, it was spelled, they helped spell it properly. I had the "in" at the end instead of where it was supposed to be, so no wonder it didn't find it.
Yeah.
Juanita, thank you so much for being a member of the channel. I really appreciate the support. Just purchased the course.
Awesome. Thank you. I think you'll like it. It's fun.
Yeah. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention this. Like, make sure that you're an adult, because you're going to hear like a lot of stuff. If your parents hear you, you're going to be like, should have been taught this in like sex ed or something, because there's so much material that'll blow your mind. But you get the same thing if you read about Mesopotamian deities and stuff. It's really, I think it's a fascinating way to view the world in terms of just how they understood things. Anyway, you gotta check out the course. So thank you for joining the course. I'll let the Queen know that we had someone shout out from the chat that they got the course. So thank you.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Stop Scamming Man again says, on the subject of historical Jesus' birth and what may have been, Dr. James Tabor gives fantastic info on his channel, including, did Jesus have a biological father, sorting out Pantera traditions. This is a whole nother rabbit trail. I won't waste too much of your time to say early, and it's not just like there are Jewish. You get this from Celsus. Celsus has Jewish sources that say that Jesus was born where a Roman soldier slept with Mary and impregnated her. So this kind of cuts out the divine birth aspect. But how much of this is historical? Well, they found a Roman sarcophagus with the man's name Pantera, and his ashes are in it. James Tabor told me he would love to get the DNA run on it, because they also have found what they think is the possible tomb of the family of Jesus. What if, it'd be a mind-boggling discovery if we found in this Jewish, their sarcophagus in this Jewish tomb, if you will, in Jerusalem, checks out to have genetic connections. I mean, super odd. What if it happens that this guy? What if though, right? Anyway.
I'm going to say no, but it's okay. You can dream on. You bring genetics into things. Oh my God. God's help you, because ancient genetics it's complicated. And it's something that I think can in some ways be done with the kings of the Valley of the Kings found in KV 35 and found in Dir al-Bahri 320, because they were related to each other.
That's what I mean.
So you're like, oh, these people related and this person's not, and we can say this or that and incestuous, whatever. But connected to what? You don't have any other genetics for Jesus. You're not going to be able to use the Turin shroud or something like that.
No.
There's no.
So they have the Talpiot tomb where they have ossuary bones of Jewish members in this tomb that have names similar to the family members described in the Gospels to Jesus, and supposedly even a Jesus one. So if the bone DNA or some elements of it that are inside of the
So if you find an ossuary, you're going to find ashes, and you're going to be able to carbon date them, but you're not going to be able to get genetic data out of that with the technology we now have. To get genetic data out of a body, you have to destroy the molar of a mummy, and think of what that destruction means. So you have to go into the body of Amenhotep III, remove a molar, and sacrifice that to science to get shitty fragmented DNA data. You're not going to be able to get it with the technology that we now have from an ossuary with bones in it.
Okay.
Like you need an intact molar with good enamel, and it's going to have contamination. It's genetic studies of antiquity are highly problematic, and just getting that data out and the amount of holes in that data, that genetic sequence are many. I'm just throwing some water on your fire.
Why? Anyway, I was having fun. Just wishful thinking. Wade Rogers, thank you so much for the super chat and being a member of the channel. My friend Acharya S. wrote Christ Conspiracy, where she outlined syncretism and the Isis Horus ties to Mary, Jesus as mother, son, and Christian ties to Egyptian myths. Do you know of her work?
No, I don't. Acharya S. Let me see. I don't know her work. And you know what? This isn't something that I spend a whole lot of time engaging with. I do deal with Egyptian religion. I do deal with Egyptian afterlife beliefs, and I work on, but I'm a historian of times of crisis in Egypt's Bronze Age collapse, and I work on gender power discussions and things like that. So this isn't an area that I delve into, but I do it for Derek. So
I'm smiling again. I'm happy that you're doing this. Yeah. Thank you, Wade. Stop scamming, man. There's a clear similarity between the crucifix and Ankh. Are there any cases of non-Egyptian Romans having Ankhs? If so, how often?
I don't know about non-Egyptian Romans, but the Coptic Church still uses the Ankh as its cross. So let that sink in, that they see the Ankh as a holy symbol. And I love that you can have a Christian understanding that Christianity pre-existed Christianity, because how do you explain that to your people? They must have children going, but the Ankh is from Egyptian religion, so you just took it from Egyptian religion. And the priest probably say, no, that was Jesus waiting to be born, and the Ankh was always there waiting for the true religious story to come out, and then we use the Ankh in that way.
Right.
But it is the Christians then taking the symbolism of the Ankh and the life that it represents, and then using it to put in their churches and to symbolize Christ. So it's I don't know if I see it anywhere else, but that is a one-to-one thing. And to associate that with the cross, and to see death as life, because the cross is a Roman method of execution, of course, and the Ankh, of course, means life. So how do you equate those things? Well, in the Egyptian mindset, it's perfect. Osiris dies so that he can live again. Jesus dies so that he can live again. Boom, you've got it. It's wonderful. It's wonderful.
I want to pull up this Deuce. So there is, I'd love to pull this up, Epiphanius from the 4th century, the Panarion. In it, he describes this god in Egypt that is celebrated by the idolaters. It's a temple with an underground chamber where on January 5th, again, gets into the research I'm recently discussing about Jesus with the early Christians, on the very same night would go into sacred readings of their scripture and singing into the morning. The same way these idolaters, according to Epiphanius, are going down into the underchamber. They're pulling out a wooden statue on a litter, bringing out a god that has, he describes it as crosses, one on each hand, one on each knee, and then one on the forehead. And the god's name is Ion. Scholars have pointed out that Ion is actually Dionysus, as well as Osiris. And then the Summa later gets connected to Adonis. But this is Dionysus, Osiris, which both were shredded to pieces, cut to pieces.
Yeah.
And put together, rebirthed, brought back to life in their text.
Yeah.
And so here's Ion being brought around in the temple. Can't remember how many times they do like a circumambulation or whatever for 7 times. And then they take him back down into the underground. His mother is Corey, who is Persephone. And then we found, like, me and Neil went in this rabbit trail and found early authors like Plutarch and Diodorus. And oh my gosh, they literally say that the mother of Osiris is Semele. That's the mother of Dionysus. So like, there's so much
for the Greeks, that wouldn't be any problem at all.
Yeah.
No problem. And people did that with Christianity when it first started to spread, and took this Jesus cult, and they made all of these connections, and that's why it's also complicated that the historical Jesus is hard to find, and all of this other ideology is there. So and it's funny then when they're like, no, but you're a heretic, but not you. Your stuff is okay, but it's.
Did you get 10%? Okay, you're good. Come on. I'm kidding.
It's all still coming. So much of it is still an amalgamation of other things, right? Other archetypes or archetypes that people know and like and connect to. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Stop Scamming Man. It says, by my understanding, Tutankhamun was deformed by inbreeding and a wrapped skull. Are there other pharaohs who anatomists concluded were deformed because of inbreeding?
There's no evidence for the wrapped skull. Egyptologists have indeed looked into this, and it seems that the 18th dynasty family had an elongated skull, and there's no clear evidence that they did wrap it, and wrapping would have created a super elongated skull. In sculpture, like the head that I had Derek pull up from the Lotus, it does look hyper elongated. It looks a little bit more elongated than his actual skull, so it's a bit of hyperbolic representation of what his head may have actually looked like, but he was his genetic information suggests inbreeding with it, that his production was from 2 close family members, right? 2 close family members, and there there's the king Seti, Siptah, whose body has also been found. Sa-Ptah is his name in Egyptian, 19th dynasty king. And he had a club foot. I don't know if genetic testing has been done on him to prove that his club foot was, which is much worse than Tutankhamun's club foot, was worse or was a product of incest. I don't know if they've done any genetic study on that. Mm-hmm. What I can say is that historically, you can see that the beginning of the 18th dynasty, for instance, began with 2 pure brother-sister marriages in a row. And that resulted in a king named Amenhotep I, who has no evidence of children, male or female, of any kind. And another man takes the kingship after him in the 18th dynasty. His name is Thutmose. He's the first Thutmose, the one born of Thoth, from the Greek name, from the Greek Thutmose of Jehotimes, right? And he was probably related to the king's family, but not of direct lineage. He then marries into the king's family, marries a woman named Ahmes. I write about this in my book, The Woman Who Would Be King, about the family of Hatshepsut. So it seems that that amount of incest at the beginning of the 18th dynasty, which makes perfect short-term sense to keep power in the family, to avoid powerful in-laws who are going to come in and want all kinds of influence and money and things like that, that you long-term create all kinds of problems, such as not being able to produce offspring, because sterility seems to be one of the key factors of an incestuous production, right? And Tutankhamun may have suffered from that as well, because we know in his tomb there were 2 stillborn children who were mummified, wrapped, and put into careful receptacles and buried with him in his tomb. It is thus far impossible to do genetic analysis of those stillborn children. I haven't checked up on this question lately, but I think they haven't been able to do genetic analysis of those bodies. Someone can check for me, but it could be that he and his half sister Ankhesenamun, Ankhesenpa'aten, as she was named before, were not able to have viable children because he's already a product of incest. Ankhesenamun is his half sister. I mean, good luck to you, right? So there's enough data out there to be able to talk about incest in a historical way, even without the genetic data at our disposal. Yeah.
Thank you. Kevin Harris says, hey, can Yahweh be found in Egypt as Yah, the moon deity? Is that Yah? how you pronounce it? Or
Iach. I mean,
yeah,
I mentioned the woman Achmes, that includes that element of the moon god. Her name Iachmes means the one who is born of the moon. I've seen this popping up a lot. This seems to be a fun rabbit hole for people to tumble down and try to connect Yahweh with Iach. I would have to ask a scholar of Hebrew and a philologist, because I'm a historian, not a philologist. I do read hieroglyphs, but I don't work with the historical linguistics of it. You would need a historical linguist to compare the phonemes of each of these names to see if there is a connection. Like people try to connect the word Amen in the Hebrew to end a prayer with Amen Re, and it doesn't work because the phonemes are different, and it would have been a different pronunciation. I'm not an expert in this, so I can't tell you if Iach and Yahweh have a similar phonemic relationship and a linguistic trail that you could follow historically. But I will say that they're very different divinities, that Yahweh is a storm god, a god of the desert, the red land, like Seth, a god of thunder and lightning. The moon god, Iach, is more like Thoth. It's a god of the night sky, of a calm night sky, a god of counting, a god of intellectualism, a god of festival counts, and they seem very different in terms of their mythologies and their divine purposes. So just from that, I'll say that they seem to be very different entities.
Yeah. Thank you. Wade Rogers again. Dr. Cooney, look into PNW Tiglet societies, matrilineal in the homes, men married into a wife's, what is this? Moiety?
Money. He means money.
Money. Okay. Sorry. Men, wife's money, but men were chiefs.
Men were chiefs and they were clan leaders. So matrilineality does not mean that women rule, right? So you say here that the men were the chiefs. Matrilineality can be used very effectively by patriarchal structures to control which man in an extended family situation is going to get power, because you're determining the matrilineage. It, like the Egyptians followed matrilineal patterns as well. That doesn't mean they were matriarchies. It means that if you have a harem of women who were having sex with the king, and the king is producing offspring with a lot of women, then you would look at the matrilineal succession to determine which king would, or which son would be king next, right? So matrilineality is a huge organizer of patrilineal or patriarchal societies, but it does not mean that women get to rule. There is one society in Tibet, and maybe the mountains of Nepal, I'm not sure, where women had more than one husband, and they did that to control population, but everyone still got to have sex. I mean, it makes sense, right? If you can't grow your population and a woman has two husbands and everyone still gets to have sex, she can only have one, maybe two babies a year if she survives the birth of twins. But it's going to keep your population down and keep some sort of cohesion in society. And even if the money goes through the woman's household and lineage, doesn't mean that she gets to complain if she's being beaten up in the household, or ask for a divorce, or rule as the leader of her elders council or whatever. There are very few places, very few societies that allow women to rule, and matrilineal societies also don't allow women to rule. So, you know, for me, it's all about women and power, and how does the power work. For people that want more information about this, I did a really fun course with Audible Originals, and the course is called Powerful Women of the Ancient World, and you can find it under my name, Kara Cooney. It has a really boring, awful cover that's just like a yellow whatever with black powerful women of the ancient world. But I go through how women found power behind the throne, behind the scenes, in Greece, in Rome, in Egypt. Egypt was the only place where women are able to find power directly as the throne holder, as nothing less than king. So that's a fun course to look into too, in addition to the course that I did with Derek on creation mythologies, in which I mentioned masturbation a whole lot more. So
Oh, so much.
That's how the world was created. So
I know.
What are you gonna do?
I've got to use the restroom here. I don't know. We've got like. You mind if I do that while you answer this?
Yeah, sure. Go for it.
Oh, do you have any idea about this one? Because if you don't have a lot of insight on this particular question, John Gear, thank you so much. Good to see you here, by the way. Can you speak to the potential origin and meaning of the name Moses? Do you have much to say here?
I have a little bit to say. Go pee, and I'll say what I can.
All right.
So I talk about this in my book, When Women Rule the World, in the chapter on Tawasret, a female king of the 19th dynasty. And it's a very complicated time period in the 19th dynasty, time period of civil war. It's when that king with the club foot, who was probably a product of incest, but we don't know, Siptah or Sa-Ptah, was living. And it seems that there were two kings trying to rule at the same time in this time period of civil war. One was a king by the name of Seti II in the north. He gave his lineage to the Siptah king. And in the south, there was another king ruling. His name was Amen-Mesu. Amen has borne him. And Amen-Mesu, in the texts at Deir el-Medina, was called Mesu for short. And some have suggested that Mesu is associated with Moses, the one who was born, right? It is an Egyptian style name, and Ramesu or Amesu, Amen-Mesu. These are, I can see why Moses could be associated with this idea of Meses or birth. And because his shortened form is Meses in the texts, I'm like, oh, isn't that interesting? It's like a Moses Meses. And it comes at the same time period in the 19th dynasty, right when you have the first mention of the land of Israel. So Israel is mentioned for the first time on something we call the Israel Stela. I'm sure most of you know what the Israel Stela is, also called the Merneptah Stela. It's a reused stela. It's a stela that Amenhotep III created and put up at his temple at Qom-el-Hitan. And Merneptah then took it over. And he mentions all of the places that he had conquered. And at the very bottom of this stela are the Israelites. And there's no interchange between R and L in the Egyptian language. So they're called Israel, the people of Israel. And they have a little people determinative in the bottom of it. And so we know that Israel was a place that existed at least in the 19th dynasty. So if I'm going to date any sort of understanding of the Exodus story, I would date it to the 19th or 20th dynasty. And to me, the Exodus story, and I think I've talked to Derek about this as well, the Exodus story is a wonderful narrative trying to understand the Bronze Age collapse and the diminishment of the most powerful state in the region. That would be Egypt, because Egypt is laid low by the Bronze Age collapse. Their pharaohs they become very weak. They're taken over by kings who some consider to have a foreign origin. We're talking around 1000 BCE. But the 19th dynasty is the beginning of this long process of diminishment. The death of Ramses II, Ramses the Great, as many call him, it resulted very shortly after in a brutal civil war between northern and southern Egyptians, when you had this southern king Amen-Mesu. And so you may have had problems with a king with two sons, sons who were fighting against each other. That gives you a little bit of a story like the Moses adopted son, and then the king, the pharaoh in the Exodus story. You get the diminishment. It fits really well for me in this 19th dynasty to 20th dynasty, late Bronze Age collapse sort of narrative. And the name fits really well. You have Meses mentioned in Egyptian texts. It's the only place that I know that you have a Meses mentioned is in these West Theban Deir el-Medina texts. So that's where I'm going to put it. It's a lot more granularity than maybe you expected, John. Most Egyptologists would never go there, but I do. And I don't know of what Hebrew Bible specialists might think of that, but
Thank you. Patty, thank you so much for the super sticker. I don't want to butcher your last name. Is it Tangi? Forgive me if I did butcher, but thank you so much for the support. I really appreciate it. A lot of love coming in. I hope you still love me after this, Kara. Few more, I promise you. Ligma FPB, thank you so much for the super chat. Love your work, Kara. Do you have any insight on who the Egyptian might have been that was mentioned in the book of Acts in the New Testament?
I don't know this. I don't know this. Tell me, Derek. Tell me everything, because it's New Testament. Isn't it funny the way we all stay in our lanes? But but also when things get into the Christian period, I'm like, too late. I can't deal with this. So tell me who this Egyptian is, and then I'll see what I can do.
There's some fun books that have been written on this by certain people who try to pin the tail on the donkey and say maybe the Egyptian was Paul. Paul snuck out of the situation. So context, there are Roman soldiers that are like arresting Paul. I believe it's Paul in this particular case in the book of Acts. And they question him, are you the Egyptian? Which was like a messianic figure. So when you go to the best way I could put it is this. Lots of people claim to be the Messiah in the first century.
Yeah.
Josephus discusses in his books about a guy who was a messianic figure he calls the Egyptian. The shortest way to the answer of why he's called the Egyptian is because every other messianic figure was Jewish. So the only way to
is that this is in Greek, I assume, and what they're using Egyptos, they're using that word for the Egyptian.
I don't know the Greek word, but I know that he is called and identified as the Egyptian. And the reason scholars like many of the scholars on Josephus and Book of Acts and stuff say he's called that is that the other messianic figures were almost all of them were Jewish. So when you went to identify them, you needed to name them, and you would name them, Jesus from Nazareth or this guy from this place. But in this case, because he's the only guy that was a messianic claimant who was Egyptian, they didn't have to give him his name. So we've lost his name to history. So they just said the Egyptian wannabe guy who tried to be the Messiah, he ends up like gathering an army, like a pretty large amount of rebels. And Rome went and had to kick his ass. And they did. And they did the same thing for a guy named Pietus. And there was also a Samaritan guy. So they would call that guy the Samaritan because he's only the one major player that was a messianic wannabe. So they didn't give him a name. But there have been some interesting books written where some have tried to identify the Egyptian as Jesus. Some have tried to identify him as this guy or that guy or this. But like most of the scholars I know say the reason he's called the Egyptian is because everyone else is a Jew. So they didn't identify him as an Egyptian.
Or you could say it's because, and again, I know nothing about this, but here I'll say something. The idea that Rome has taken over and imperialized this Mediterranean world, and that the people becoming the Messiah or claiming to be the Messiah is as much an ideological opposition to that imperial occupation as anything else. And so why would Egypt not want to get in on this game? And if you tell me he's raising an army, then this is a rebellion. And the Egyptians had rebellions against empires before. They had rebellions against the Persian Empire. They had rebellions against the Assyrian imperial occupation. And they had collaborators too. Uja-Horezna was a collaborator with the Persian Empire. And then there were people who fought against it, right? So the whole 26th dynasty is a collaborator with the Assyrian Empire, you could argue. So I would put it into that imperial historical schema. And other than that, I'm not going to dare to comment more.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's really cool. I'll look into it. I didn't know about this. Yeah.
Some of them have noticed, people who wrote on this have noticed that like they think there's overlap between the Garden of Gethsemane scene with Jesus and the soldiers that come. You remember they all fall like they're dead in the story of John. That specific one has like all the soldiers there. Jesus has the power and like they all fall as they're dead. But he like Peter cuts off one of the ears, these kind of themes. They are trying to find that they think some of that echoes the Egyptian in some way. And I can't remember because it's been 4 or 5 years since I interviewed. It's Anna Einhart. I can't remember her name, but she wrote a book about this and it's pretty funny. Pretty cool to think about.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Stop Scamming Man just did a wiki rummage on Seth's page called Set Animal. Says he was portrayed as donkey-headed and even just a donkey. While I thought it was just because of modesty, donkeys have meaning in the Bible.
Oh, no. Donkeys are very important for ancient Egypt. And a donkey is, how do I say this politely? An animal who is generously endowed, I would say. And donkeys are beasts of burden. They're, you know, we were just talking about this in my grad seminar, like why the donkey? The donkey is so much a part of the domesticated space. It's there. It docilely, may be loud, but it docilely does what you need it to do. It carries the burden. It's not chaotic really that much, though. When a donkey wants to misbehave, it's going to misbehave. You can try to get it back into line, but the donkey, as associated with Seth, I'm trying to think when the earliest instance of that would be, probably New Kingdom, but it really takes off in Greco-Roman Egypt. And I'll put that in with ideas of sexuality, being loud shouts and cries. Donkeys are always very, very loud. And there's also association with the turtle or the tortoise, disagreement there, and the hippo. So Seth can be associated with many animals. The gazelle, that one's easier because it's of the desert. So you're like, okay. And the hippo is obviously chaotic. So we get that. When you go to Edfu Temple and you see Horus destroying Seth, where Seth really is thought of as a demonic creature that must be destroyed like Apophis. It's ironic that the god who was there responsible for spearing Apophis becomes speared like Apophis. You know, no good deed goes unpunished, but he's often depicted as a hippo in Edfu, sometimes as a donkey, sometimes as a gazelle as well, where they're corralling and controlling and fettering this beast of this demon of scary proportions. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Again, sorry you repeated the super chat. I really appreciate the support, but we did cover that one about the fictional drink of sorrow. Tiger Shark says USF. You know, I watched some fights here. USF professor confirms Egyptians drank hallucinogenic cocktails and ancient rituals. Google it.
I love that. Google it. I will.
Google.
It's funny. Yes, of course they did. Every human being consumes hallucinogenic, mind-altering substances to get to God. This is not, or to just have fun, right? This is a human thing. So there's a wonderful discussion by my Dr. Mutter, that means the woman who advised me for my PhD, Betsy Bryan, who has articles with titles like Sex, Drugs, Rock and Roll in Ancient Egypt. And she talks about something called a feast of drunkenness, in which she argues with convincing evidence that the Egyptians were not just drinking beer on the beautiful Feast of the Valley celebration, in which they commune with the dead and try to connect in every sort of way to find power with the other side, but they're also consuming opium with that beer or other hallucinogenic substances. Wow. And there's tomb scenes where a girl is just thrown up and they're like, make her drink more. And it seems that, get her going again. Like you have to drink so much that you get completely drunk and stoned and out of your mind. You collect together in a tomb space, temple space. And when people are having sex too, all kinds of rules are thrown away during this festival. And then the goddess reveals herself to the people. So you need the imbibing of intoxicants and hallucinogens to be able to actually see the goddess and perceive her and connect with her. And the Egyptians had rituals and festival days to help them to connect with the goddess. And also to deal with the more scary sides of the goddess. The goddesses of Egypt were associated with the kind of like goddesses of the Hindu religion, like Kali and Durga, for those of you who are more familiar with them. A lot of violence and protective aspects that is kind of like a sawn-off shotgun. You know, you make a shot and you don't know who you're going to hit. And these goddesses could, when provoked, really go after everybody and not just those who had done wrong. Kind of like the flood story, right?
Right.
It goes after everyone. And only even people who are good are not saved, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you, Tiger Shark, for the support. This next one made me laugh. Dr. Floroma, not good to see you here. Longtime fan, and you've been supporting us forever with these super chats. Do you ever marvel at how spot on Joseph Smith was in translating the book of Abraham and finally uncovering Reformed Egyptian? We were talking about this earlier.
We were talking about it. And one last thing, for the person asking about hallucinogens, there's also lotus and lily hallucinogens. Now go back. I just wanted to mention that because he was a UF professor. I think that there was lotus residue found in some receptacles, and I think that's what they're talking about. But anyway,
by the way, this ties in with our apologist issue initially, but please, I don't want to steal
this is perfect. So I have been involved in these questions for some time because they're if you Google my name, Kara Cooney, and LDS, you'll go down a whole rabbit hole of your own. But it's interesting that the Book of Abraham was thought to have been translated by Joseph Smith directly, he tells us, from the Egyptian, before Egyptian was translated by Champollion, and he used his direct communion with God to do this, we are told, and he then ended up creating the Book of Abraham. That book was is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and a scholar named Robert Rittner has published a whole monograph on this book. It's a book of breathing, we call it. That's what the Egyptians called it, a book of breathing, but it's essentially a book of the dead. Got it. And this book of the dead, the hieroglyphs, for anybody who can read Egyptian hieroglyphs, who's worked with Book of the Dead translations, and Robert Rittner works through it as a text edition. So you go through it word by word, line by line, to see what this book of breathing actually says. And it says what other books of breathing say, what other Book of Dead type texts say, which is not what the Book of Abraham says. Now, I know that there are Mormon apologists, LDS practitioners, some of whom have PhDs, one of whom has a PhD from UCLA, that would be a person named Carrie Mulstein, who have done podcasts and videos and other things where they say, because they have PhDs in Egyptology, that the Book of Abraham is in actual translation of the Egyptian into the Book of Abraham. And I'm here to tell you as an Egyptologist that that is not true, that you actually have people who have PhDs in Egyptology who are saying that, but it isn't the case. The Egyptian text does not say anything close to what the Book of Abraham is. So however, then, if you're an apologist, a Mormon apologist, LDS apologist, then you would say, oh no, but it's reformed Egyptian. It's a different kind of Egyptian. And then you have to create a whole language that's that's going to support what the Book of Abraham says. And people do this, right? So it's a way of supporting the ideology that you have, rather than knowing, what did we say? You're not going to go to hell. Everything's going to be okay. Study and learn, open your mind, and you'll be able to see that these are all just people finding different ways of understanding humanity and divinity.
Yeah.
And so this is not a spot-on translation of what the Egyptian is at all. In fact, it's completely different. And the Book of Abraham, interestingly, includes a pictorial image. It's funny, you can't go into the Bible and get any pictures, right?
No.
But because Joseph Smith is translating this from an Egyptian text, he actually includes a picture with captions. And the Book of Breathing that he was working with had breaks in it, in the papyrus. And he's sure of Anubis standing over a mummy and putting his hands on the mummy and supporting the mummy and protecting it and making sure its organs are intact and that the mummy will survive in the manner of Osiris, right? Because every dead person is meant to be reborn in the manner of Osiris, just like Jesus died for us and our sins so we can be reborn and all of that. Sorry about my camera.
It's the spirit of Abraham trying to.
I guess maybe the spirit of Joseph Smith.
That's right.
But the captions that Joseph Smith, he gives little captions in the Book of Abraham. It's amazing. He interprets this scene as a human sacrifice. And it's a whole story that's there in the Book of Abraham about a specific human sacrifice associated with Abraham and Isaac, right? And that's the story that he's representing. But if you know your books of the dead, or you know your Egyptian coffins of the late period, or you know your books of breathing, then you know that this is the mummification scene of the body on the bier, and it is by no means a human sacrifice. And the canopic jars are there, and elements of kingship are represented. It's a typical scene of the late period into the Greco-Roman period from such a book of breathing. So for anybody who wants to follow up on this, again, you can Google my name and LDS or Mormon or whatever, and you'll go down a whole rabbit hole, which is interesting in and of itself. But you can also look at Robert Rittner's book about the Book of Mormon and the papyrus that Joseph Smith used. It's really interesting stuff, and it gives you an idea of how people use ideology to control within patriarchal, hierarchical societies, and how it still functions very, very well to this day.
So just one more, like, just a clarification of that. Before we figured out hieroglyphics and knew what what they meant, he gets this papyri. He then translates it, but really, if we were trying to, like, let's just suppose the dude's not a prophet, but he's a smart business move and he's knowing how to control a cult and trying to keep his constituency money coming in and stuff. And he says, look, this is what it says. Is it fair to say that he did not know, like, no one had currently cracked the code yet? And so here he is making up shit. And, like, then we crack the code and we can actually fact check it. And now people have to bend over backwards to make the words be a different language, like you just described. So that's
indeed
in that chronology.
It is. And, you know, I don't want to be totally cynical about LDS religion, because though, wow, taking the divine feminine out and commodifying women is very much a part of that patriarchal structure, right? With polygamy and all of these things. Not that the Levantine religions didn't have polygamy as well. They certainly did. Polygyny, right? But I'm sure that Joseph Smith and Brigham Young believed what they were coming up with, what they were inventing, what ideology they thought was the real and true ideology, connecting it with New World indigenous structures and Jesus having been in other places before, bringing magic arguably back into a Christian context from which it had been removed, expunged. It's a really interesting, whenever I say, Judeo-Christian Islamic, I always say Judeo-Christian Islamic LDS traditions, because I do see it as a continuation of this. But indeed, you are right. He translates this text at a time when no one can read Egyptian, when Champollion hadn't realized that Coptic was Egyptian written in Greek, and Champollion was a Coptologist. And then once he cracked which hieroglyphs were which, he's like, oh my God, I can read Egyptian because I know Coptic, right? It's not like he rediscovered it. Coptic was already there. People were already working with Coptic. But Joseph Smith did not know Coptic. Joseph Smith did not know how the text connected, how the hieroglyphic script connected to Coptic. And his Book of Abraham and the whole Book of Mormon is very much a lineage of the King James Bible, and the way that it's translated is in that 17th century English, right? Thou makest of the, those old fashioned words. And he's doing that in his translation that he is coming up with his own divine connection to God, or however or to understand that he did it. But it is certainly not spot on. And it is certainly not a one-to-one translation. But I know that there are Mormon Egyptologists out there telling you that it is. And why would you doubt them? Because they have PhDs from UCLA and Yale and other places, and Chicago and other places. So why would you not think that they're correct? Why would somebody lie to you about that? But they'll just dissemble. This is what apologists do. They'll say, oh no, but it's a reformed Egyptian, right? It's a different kind of Egyptian, and thus, and so you can find a way to make this work for whatever ideology you're trying to convince people is true. Yeah.
So much. The whole nother video should be done on this. Vesper, thank you so much for the super chat. Was Osiris eaten as bread and blood drank as wine?
More bread and beer. And like I said to Derek earlier on, it was it's interesting that in the Eucharist, the bread and the wine is offered to the people in communion, whereas in Egyptian ritual, the bread and beer and wine and milk is offered to the god, and it's offered to the god to help wake up the god, and then that meal is shared in communion by the priests and the community at the temple. So this idea of consecrating food by offering it up to divinity, and notice in the Eucharist, as a Catholic, you know this, that they offer up the bread and wine to God first. Very Akhenaten-like. It is for God to consume first. Then you bring it down to earth after God has consumed it, and you share it with the community, and then everyone gets access to that that bread and beer or bread and wine, but it is a very Egyptian thing, and we call it the reversion of offerings. So think of it as a communal meal, and the answer is absolutely yes. And then what I was talking about with the question about hallucinogens, there's a wonderful festival called the Beautiful Feast of the Valley, in which everyone would go to the family tomb, hang out with the dead ancestors, which, you know, we still do to this day in some places, right? Hang out with the dead ancestors. I was just at Forest Lawn for on a Sunday, and everyone was there hanging out with the dead, having barbecues. I couldn't believe it. It was pretty crazy. The Egyptians would have loved it. And you have your Day of the Dead moment, and you share a communal meal with the ancestors and with the gods. So is Osiris a part of that? Yes. Do you consume bread and beer? Those are the first offerings that you give to the dead. And the wine and beer disconnect, just understand that in wet places like Egypt or Germany, you grow beer. In dry places like Italy or Southern California or the Levant, wine is what grows there better. So that's going to be your, and all of these liquids are a way of fermenting and storing grain. You can't keep grain forever, but you can keep beer and wine a pretty damn long time, right? So it's a way of keeping that commodity around a little bit longer. And everyone would have drunk beer and wine because water was so tainted with worms and other things. So imagine in the ancient world that you're always drinking a kombucha kind of product. You're always drinking a low alcohol beer all day long. Children are drinking it. This is a way you keep fermented good bacteria in your gut. We should probably return to it. Let's all go have a kombucha. But this is the ancient way of preserving this. So yeah, bread and beer communally, absolutely. Yeah.
There's so much more we have to discuss and get into. Dr. Kara Cooney, ladies and gentlemen, honestly, this has been an outstanding live stream. I hope people will go sign up for your course. They will become your students. You can join them in Zoom classes where questions can be asked, but also you're able to take things further in terms of taking what's being discussed in the course and going further, or maybe people want clarification. But they'll be personal students of yours. They'll own the courses for life. We'll be recording those Zoom meetings as well and putting them into the classes. So anyone who signs up at any point will be able to watch them. But if you want to participate, sign up, because we're actively trying to make that happen. And if this is successful, we'd like to do more. We have one coming too down the road about resurrection mythology in ancient Egypt. However, come join, become a student now, support her work, get her books, go to her website, check out her podcast, go watch her dismantle LDS theology. There's so much stuff. You can go watch her on Amazon.
So much.
Yeah, you're a mess, aren't you? You like to get your hands dirty.
I do. It's a pain. It's a pain, but you know, it's good. It's all good.
It is. It is. We got one little final here. The people's weenus word.
That's awesome.
Thank you so much for that super chat. Seriously, you're fantastic. Any final words from you, Kara, before we end up rolling out here? Mushroom Farmers Guild. Thank you so much.
No, just stay open-minded, keep learning, know that we're all like, you remember on Twitter a couple of days ago when America was united by the assassination of a CEO? Weird things are happening in this world, and there seems to be a whole lot of division, but I see a whole lot of change. All that we discussed just now says as much about where we are as a society and where we have to go as it does about the past. And remember that we use the past to understand the present. That's how I work with history. And so this is all of us just trying to figure out the crazy world that we exist in. And I find that all incredibly interesting and rather hopeful, I might say.
I've enjoyed this. I know there's so much more we will need to discuss. This is just scratching the surface, honestly. And again, we have courses coming out. We have courses already with other academics, but yours right now, that is in the description. I pinned it here in the chat. Hope that you'll show some support by getting you, I guess, signing up. I'll also tell the queen, and she'll see it, and she'll be happy. So, you know, happy wife, happy life. So, you know. Thank you so much, Dr. Cooney.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on, Derek. It's always so much fun.
You as well. Ladies and gentlemen, never forget, we are MythVision.
Son, do you want to know what the truth is? After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill and you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland, and I show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.